Chapter 160. The mercenary captain noticed Brando's movement and paused for a moment. "My lord. I'll go around to its back." Brendel interrupted him and said, "The ghost knight may be an undead, but its intelligence was close to that of a normal human. It wasn't going to stay here and let these weaklings slowly drag it to death. As long as it had about 10% of its HP left, it would decisively retreat. But of course, Brando would not let this opportunity slip away. No, it's too dangerous." The Nightsong Tiger paused for a moment. He could guess what Brando was going to do and quickly stopped him. "I'll go in your place." "You know what I'm going to do?" Brando retorted. As a matter of fact, he didn't want to do it. Although he was always the one to clean up the mess, he knew that the other party was a Spectre Knight, and in this world, even the slightest mistake was intolerable. It was not as simple as losing a level but losing one's life. Anyone who was faced with such a situation would be so nervous that their heart would be pounding. The only thing he could rely on was his innate ability, indomitable will. As long as his heart and head were protected, he could at least guarantee that he would not die like a normal person. At the very least, he could finish his will without any problems. "You can tell me what to do, my lord," the mercenary captain replied. "We're your subordinates after all, you don't have to do everything yourself." "I also wish to save you the trouble," Brando smiled and took out the rope from before, "but unfortunately you can't learn this." "What is it?" "Do you know alchemy?" The Nightsong Tiger was stunned. If he knew alchemy, why would he need to be a mercenary? The middle-aged man could not help but roll his eyes. The battle did not come to an end that quickly. The Ghost Knight's defense was one of the best among level 35 elites, and even level 40 monsters. Not to mention other things, its glowing spiritual body armor could block most attacks. The four-armed crossbow provided by the army for iron-ranked soldiers was widely circulated among the mercenaries. Although it was prohibited, most nobles would turn a blind eye to it. However, this crossbow could only be deflected by a person with 5 ounces or above. Although it was terrifying in the eyes of normal people, it was no different from scratching an itch to the Ghost Knight. Only a few arrows that hit its vitals could deal effective damage, but at most, it would only deal a few points of damage. Moreover, the Spectre Knight was not a wooden dummy. Although its agility was greatly reduced in the range of the altar and it was bound by the wind-binding arrow, the difference in strength was still there. It was still able to dodge nimbly. This did not even take into account the 40% chance of damage to its body. But he was not in a hurry. The Nightsong Tiger still had 4 ice-rending arrows and 6 wind-binding arrows. With the remaining duration, he should be able to hold on for at least 10 minutes. 10 minutes, with more than 10 iron-ranked mercenaries surrounding him, even a level 35 boss would lose a layer of skin. Not to mention a small elite. While the Spectral Knight was focused on playing whack-a-mole, Brendel took the opportunity to sneak into the forest behind it. The distance between him and the Spectral Knight was not too far, but it was about half the distance of the field. If he got any closer, the ghost might have noticed him, but if he got any further, the accuracy of his arrows would decrease. After all, he was no longer the level 130 warrior who could shoot the right eye but not the left eye from a few hundred meters away. He was a weapon master. It was better to be safe than sorry. However, he did not come here to ambush the Ghost Knight from behind. It might be effective, but the effect would not be great. Unless he had reached silver level rank 1 and learned a skill related to archery, he might be able to deal a critical hit and take away 10% of the Ghost Knight's HP. However, it was not possible now. He glanced at the battlefield not far away. The heated battle there was in stark contrast to the silence here. Brando took a deep breath and parted the bushes on the ground. He then drew an alchemy circle on the sand with his long sword. If Tamar was here, he would know that his previous advice was in vain. After drawing another energy infusion formation, he drew another blood refining formation. It was obvious that he was planning to bring this forbidden technique to greater heights. After that, he threw the coiled rope into the center of the magic circle and threw in the soul crystal he got from the Lich in Fortress Reden. To be honest, he was a little sad. The soul crystal of the intermediate Lich was not easy to get, especially since Madara and Erwin had already made peace. The next war would be many years later. If it was not for the fact that he did not have a better substitute, he would not have wasted such a precious material. Of course, his life was more important. He turned around and cut his finger with his long sword. A drop of blood fell into the circle. His heart suddenly tightened. Brando immediately felt that his HP was reduced by more than a third. The higher the grade of the material, the higher the energy requirement. Although he had expected this, he was still surprised. He could not help but laugh. He was glad that the only material he had was not the demon dragon's heart. Otherwise he would have been sucked dry. Of course this was just a thought. If he really had the demon dragon's heart, he would have just taken it to the Emperor of Cruz. He could even change the king of a duchy. But when he thought of the rare material, he could not help but feel his heart skip a beat. He also remembered the thing in his backpack. He could not help but open his backpack to take a look. A golden light was reflected in the young man's eyes. The light seemed to have a life of its own as it pulsated rhythmically, just like a heart. Brando took a deep breath. This was a secret that he did not tell anyone. There was no other reason because it was too important. Of course, he was almost sure who put this thing in his backpack. It was just that he did not understand. It was just a chance encounter. The other party did not seem to have any reason to do this. What was the motive? Framing? Or probing? Brando was not happy when he thought of this. To be honest, this thing was important to some people, but it was not of much use to him. He was only 4 levels away from activating his second talent, but he already had a goal and he did not rely on this thing. He thought for a while, but he still had no clue. So his mind quickly returned to reality. At present, his biggest problem was the Ghost Knight. It was better to put other things aside for the time being. He glanced at the alchemy product in the circle. It was originally an ordinary rope, but now it had become as black as ink, and it was constantly emitting a faint black light. This thing looked like an immortal binding rope. Of course, in terms of color, compared to the shiny immortal binding rope in many cultivation novels, it might need to be renamed the demon binding rope. Brendel mocked himself for a moment. He knew that this thing was actually a crude alchemy product that could not be any cruder. He simply injected the energy from the soul crystal into the rope. But what made him not know whether to laugh or cry was that the raw materials used were ridiculously high quality, which was why this ordinary rope had turned into such a state. He thought that if Tamar knew that he was wasting God's gift so recklessly, she would probably use the Soul Walker to give him a beating. Alright. In this history, the future master alchemist had not yet refined the so-called semi-divine scythe. Brando immediately realized this and corrected his thoughts. He picked up the rope and looked at the other side of the battlefield, quietly waiting for the moment when the battle was over. The Spectre Knight was struggling in vain. At first, it hit a few people with its Spear of Spirit, but those were just scratches caused by the wind pressure. But soon, the mercenaries became more cautious, and the fierce undead immediately exposed its nature as a paper tiger. Although the undead creature was not afraid or happy, it gradually became a little impatient. Especially the mount it was sitting on, which could not help but raise and lower its 4 hooves in annoyance. Seeing this scene, the Nightsong Tiger was a little worried at first. His main concern was that the Spectre Knight would launch another 1,000 army strike. However, the Spectre Knight was able to endure it after suffering a setback. After all, if it launched another 1,000 army strike, it might directly kill him. The Ghost Knight had the ability to calculate, so naturally, it would not make such a low-level mistake. Of course, it did not know that it had been making a low-level mistake all along. The mercenary captain fired the last frost-burst arrow. After nearly 10 minutes of fighting, the Spectre Knight could no longer hold on. Its upper body, which was almost covered in a thick layer of frost, began to creak. It then began to retreat. The undead creature retreated so quickly that it was almost beyond everyone's imagination. They thought that after being hit by so many ice bolts, the undead creature's mobility would be limited, but it seemed that it was only a little. The Nightsong Tiger reacted quickly and immediately shot another wind-binding arrow, but unfortunately, it did not have much effect. The mercenaries exclaimed in surprise, and some of them wanted to chase after it, but the Nightsong Tiger immediately stopped them. What a joke! If the Ghost Knight turned around and attacked them, they would all die here. It would be fine if they died here, but if Brando died, then they would be doomed eternally. The Nightsong Tiger looked at the forest. He knew that the mysterious lord would come up with a solution. Unknowingly, the mercenaries had developed a kind of trust in Brando. But as expected, 2 shining silver arrows appeared in the dark forest one after the other, like 2 white lines that stretched forward against the black background. It was so eye-catching. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com to read more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 161. Guiding Arrow. Someone shouted from the back. It was the Elementalist sisters. They were the ones who made the magic arrows, and only they knew the effects of the arrows. These 2 silver arrows had the most unique magic brilliance among all the types of magic arrows. Other than the guiding arrow, there was no other possibility. But in fact, even if they didn't say it, the other mercenaries also saw it. But why did their lord use the guiding arrow at this time? Although the guiding arrow was a magic arrow, its damage was no different from an ordinary crossbow. To put it bluntly, it was not as powerful as a steel crossbow shot from a four-armed crossbow. Other than its accuracy, it was useless. Could it be that the Lord knew the monster's weakness? This thought flashed through everyone's mind at this moment. But things didn't go as they wished, because they saw the two guiding arrows nailed into the trunks of two tall trees. With two soft sounds, the arrows went straight into the trees. Wait, did they miss? Everyone couldn't help but have such a strange thought at this moment. If it was possible, many of them would be sweating profusely at this moment. Since ancient times, no one had ever heard of anyone being able to deflect a guided arrow. What kind of powerful ability did one have to be able to deflect a guided arrow with magic? But this was not the time to be amazed by such a powerful ability. Wait, what is that? However, there were a few sharp-eyed mercenaries among the dozen or so mercenaries. They finally saw a thin line behind the two guiding arrows. No, it was not a line but a rope. The two guiding arrows that went into the trunks of the two tall trees pulled the rope straight up to the chest. At this moment, it was less than 3 meters away from the ghost knight who was galloping in the forest. A tripping rope. Everyone finally came to their senses. But they didn't have time to be amazed by Brando's wonderful idea, because there was another problem. The ghost knight was a spiritual creature, and physical restrictions couldn't affect it at all without hitting its core. Could it be that the Lord had not considered this point? The ghost knight desperately hoped that Brando had not considered this point. Unfortunately, things did not go as he wished. The number of ghost knights that Brando had killed in his previous life was probably more than the total number of ghost knights that had died in this world. How could he forget such a common-sense question? A black light flashed on the rope, and the ghost knight and his horse stood up high. If the knight and the horse were real, they would have easily broken the thin rope at this speed. But at this moment, the soul power attached to the rope made the undead suffer. It felt as if it had hit a steel cable. Then it was lifted into the air and flew backward. This was the moment Brando had been waiting for. The ghost knight was too agile and he could not aim while riding on his mount. However, it was different now. Before elemental activation, he had never heard of anyone who could turn around in midair. As for the divine skill of stepping on the back of the right foot and turning in midair, it was even more unheard of. He raised his hand and the ruby ring that Freya gave him shone in the dark. His heart moved and a laser-like red line shot out from the ruby, hitting the chest of the ghost knight in midair. Flame? He chanted the activation words and a golden light bloomed. This light moved along the red line from slow to fast. In the blink of an eye, it had hit the undead that had not had time to fall to the ground. At that moment, it was as if the surrounding starlight had dimmed and was absorbed by a point with the golden light as the center. The surroundings became extremely dark, and then a ball of fire seemed to bloom from the center of the darkness. With a roar, the air shot in all directions like knives. The air traveled so fast that the sound was misplaced. After a moment of extreme silence, Brando heard a terrible roar that swept through his entire hearing. With the explosion as the center, all the trees within a 10-meter radius were vaporized, and the soil crystallized. Further away, the leaves were charred and curled up, and the heat waves rolled, washing the faces of everyone present. Everyone was stunned, and the younger of the two wild elves murmured, "Fireball, is the Lord still an elementalist with silver-level strength?" As the elder elemental, she covered her fair forehead with her hand and replied, "It's just a magic item." But even so, the girl's voice could not hide the surprise. She could hardly believe that they had won and there were almost no casualties. They had indeed won. Brando had received the EXP prompt that he had successfully reached level 23. 2 more levels and the second talent could be activated. Compared to the first talent, which was only to reflect the characteristics of the characters, the second talent was the core talent that determined the later development path of a character. It was also the most important talent. It's a pity that the flying time of Fireball is still too long, otherwise it would be much easier to use this directly. Brando sighed. He looked at the crackling forest and knew that the flames would soon be extinguished. Because there was no real fire here, and the extremely high temperature only existed at the moment of the explosion. The flames that everyone saw now were just an illusion formed by the elemental clusters. Otherwise, no one in the game would choose to use fire spells. A fireball would reduce the loot by half and no one could accept it. He let out a long sigh, took out a water bag and drank. This battle could not be said to be exhausting, and it was not even comparable to many of the battles he had experienced in the game in the past. At that time, sometimes people did not even have the strength to move their fingers after a day. But this time was different, and it was a real race against time. Every opportunity was so precious and important that he could not afford to make a mistake. Fortunately, he found that he had not thrown away all his past experiences. But he was sighing, and what happened in the fire soon made him stop in surprise. When the flames dissipated, Brando found that the ghost knight did not turn into ashes. Instead, it was lying quietly on the ground, and the evil spirit mount stopped beside it, gently touching its master's hand. It was just that the soul fire of the evil spirit mount and the ghost knight that were shining in the dark had dissipated to varying degrees. This dissipation was continuing, and the spiritual armor on their bodies quickly cracked and dissipated like a layer of smoke, revealing the body that was originally wrapped in heavy armor or a layer of shell. The spirit of the unicorn. Brando was stunned as he looked at the beautiful body of the evil spirit mount after the bone layer made of soul power fell off. It was like the most majestic and muscular warhorse, and its beautiful body and the long horn on its forehead all showed its identity. But wait, in the legends of Wond, didn't the unicorn only become the mount of the purest girl? The young man subconsciously looked down and couldn't help but spit out the mouthful of water in his mouth. Some even choked his nose, causing him to cough violently. After the armor of the ghost knight completely dissipated, there was actually an elven girl sleeping peacefully under the armor, like a princess. No, it should be said that it was the soul of an elven girl. The silver mark on her forehead was still there, which in the customs of the silver elves meant that she was not yet an adult. It seemed that this was a child who died young, but now was not the time to sigh. Brando thought of the fierce ghost knight that fought with them for 300 rounds. It was actually an underage girl? Who could tell him what kind of ridiculous situation was this? But fortunately, the soul of the elven girl was still wearing a very soft long dress after the spiritual armor disintegrated, so Brando would not be in a more awkward situation. At this time the others gathered around. They originally came to congratulate their lord and celebrate. But just like Brando, when they saw the appearance of their enemy, they were all stunned. This is... The Nightsong Tiger looked at the translucent spirit lying quietly in the middle of the empty space created by the fireball and did not know what to say for a moment. Amandina was also shocked and asked, "The one from before. Was it her?" Brando nodded. Even though it was a little unbelievable, it seemed to be the truth. Besides, it wasn't impossible. After all, evil spirits wouldn't appear out of thin air. In fact, he had suspected that the Spectre Knight might be the projection of the souls of the Silver Elf Kings in the tomb of the Silver Elf Kings, but he didn't expect it to be a lowly. Amandina frowned and reluctantly accepted this explanation. "Did we kill her?" a voice asked. Brando turned his head and saw that the one who spoke was the younger of the Wild Elven sisters. Unlike her elder sister who only frowned slightly, this little girl was clearly concerned about whether they killed one of her kind. In fact, the Wild Elves and the Silver Elves were obviously different. Even though the Elves and the Winged Elves in Wond were called the embodiment of beauty, the Wild Elves' beauty was like the warm afternoon sun, bright and warm. In fact, the Wild Elves were one of the races that had the best relationship with humans. Many of them lived and reproduced in human society. On the other hand, the Silver Elves were cold and unapproachable. Because of the ancient prophecy, they had long been isolated from the world and left the world with a mysterious and arrogant impression. The Silver Elves were generally taller than humans, and their bodies were slender and graceful. They were the first nobles of the land and were born to be nobles. The feeling they gave others was like the cold and beautiful moonlight. The spirit of the elven girl lying quietly on the ground was a stark contrast to the Wild Elven sisters. The young man's gaze fell on the Roman again. The young lady's eyes expressed the same desire, but in comparison, she seemed to want the answer she was looking for more. Brando shook his head and his gaze fell on the spirit's body. This phenomenon meant that the spirit's power was disintegrating, and the power that maintained the elven girl's existence in this world was extremely weak. Even though she did not immediately disappear, it was likely that she would not be able to hold on for long. She died long ago. Even now, her spirit is only on the verge of disintegrating. Romain let out a sigh of pity. But when Brando said this, he could not help but click his tongue. Just how much life did she have? After taking a hit from his strike of the 1,000 armies, being beaten up by the mercenaries for half a day, and then followed up with a fireball spell, she should have died even if she was 10 levels higher. But the reality was that the elven girl was lying there perfectly fine. She was sleeping beauty. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.gdn.com to read more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 162. In the Dream. The palace of the Silver Elves was still the same as in his memory. The white spires, the white arches, the white corridors and the white railings. How long ago was that dream, sister? What's your name? The voice in the dream was as sharp as ever. I'm sorry. In the dream, he remembered his mother saying that when he gently pressed his hand to his chest, he could feel the beating of the heart and the residual warmth of life in his palm. Only when he was close to it would he feel at ease. But it was precisely because of this that the scenery of his childhood in Charlotte Village became clear. He really wanted to go back to that time. I'm sorry, sister. I'm sorry, father. It's all my fault. Brando's words also made him realize something else. Rather than saying that the little girl had too much blood, it might be better to say that there was another possibility. That was the setting of the storyline mission. The strategy guide did not mention the details of how to activate the altar, although Brando believed that he could find the right way with his own experience. But now it seemed that the method was already in front of him? But since it was a mission, then the little girl would probably wake up soon. After all, the game would not let the players wait for too long. Brando raised his head and looked at the starry night sky, wondering if this world was the same. The mercenaries were whispering to each other. Amandina grabbed Roman's hand and looked nervously at the underage silver elf girl on the ground. No one dared to get too close. After all, the spirit of the unicorn was still guarding by her side. Who knew if it would suddenly attack and hurt people? But as Brando expected, soon the little girl's eyelashes moved, and then she opened her eyes. It was a pair of somewhat confused eyes. The rainbow was silver and seemed a little hollow. But the hollow eyes seemed to be injected with a lot of things in an instant, like memories, emotions and some more complicated factors. After a pause, the little girl's body moved. She turned her head and everyone's faces, including Brando's, were reflected in her vision. She seemed to remember something. She frowned and showed a painful expression, then curled up and coughed violently. She released her hand, and her palm was covered in silver blood. Then she trembled as she groped around on the ground. She gritted her teeth and tried to grab the silver spear on the other side. The mercenaries drew their weapons vigilantly, and some of them seemed to want to stop her. Brendel, she can't fight anymore. Amandina turned around and whispered to Brendel. The elven girl's previous performance seemed to have touched this noble lady. She had been down and out before, so she could empathize with the elven girl. It was as if the elven girl had struck the weakest spot in her heart. She did not have the ability to fight anymore. Brando nodded. This spirit had already entered the final stage of death. At this time, even if he stood there and let her kill him, she would not have the ability to do so. A spirit was able to stay in this world by relying on a persistent wish for something. This wish was the power of her soul. However, after the power of her soul dissipated, her last connection with this world would disappear as well. From then on, the meaning of this little elf girl's words completely disappeared from this world without a trace. Indeed, after groping for a while, the elf girl suddenly stopped. Because she saw that her hand on the ground was faintly discernible, as if it was going to disappear at any time. Brando raised his hand and stopped the others. In fact, he did not need to remind them. The mercenaries all stopped their actions. If the Spectre Knight from before was so powerful that it struck fear in people's hearts, then this elven girl's spectre was so weak that it made people want to protect her. Mr. Human, am I going to disappear? The elf girl looked at her disappearing hand in a daze and suddenly asked. Her voice was like a nightingale in an empty forest. It was unbelievably pleasant. Even the wild elf sister could not help but exclaim softly. The wild elves were also excellent musicians. However, in front of the elven nobles, the silver elves, they were still inferior in every aspect. Ever since the elves of Wone passed down from the golden bloodline, there were only two purest silver elves. One was the silver elves and the other was the mist elves. Because the golden bloodline had long disappeared, the silver elves and the mist elves became the elven royalty. Brando nodded silently. The quest came, but he suddenly found that he could not be happy. In the game, he would not be affected by this scene because he knew that it was just an NPC. But here he found that he could not be cold-blooded. You? Amandina whispered, that night from before? Was it you? The elf girl did not answer and nodded silently. Her arms and legs were beginning to become transparent. But she looked up and forced a smile. I killed a lot of people? So Lady Martha must have abandoned me? That's not your fault. Brando replied. That incident in history was indeed the Holy Cathedral of Fire was not kind enough, or else Lady Martha would not be so furious. In fact, Erwin's fate had been declining ever since. Besides, he had basically figured out the cause and effect. It must be that the monks of the Holy Cathedral of Fire wanted to change the contract between the ancient silver elves, Martha, and the elven goddess Shay. Brando had done things like changing the contract of the gods before. It was not complicated, but it was very risky. He was a player, so he naturally could bear it. He did not know where Erwin's people got the guts to do it, but in the end, it still allowed the evil spirits to take advantage of the situation. That led to a tragedy. Presumably, this little girl was not the only one controlled by the evil spirits at that time, but the high-ranking monks of the Holy Cathedral of Fire were not to be trifled with. After a tragic battle that was not recorded in history, this temple disappeared from all official records from then on, and was ruined until now. What's your name? Brando found that even at this time, the Romans' question was still so constructive. My name is Medicia, and my surname is Crescent Moon. The elf girl answered. You're not of the royal family? Brando and Amandina were stunned and asked in unison. The royal family of the Silver Elves had the same surname as the Empire. The Heron royal family was the purest of the Silver Elves, and if they were not of the purest blood, they would not be able to enter this tomb. Yes, I'm the daughter of an artisan. But this is the tomb of the Silver Elves? Amandina pressed on. This question stunned the elf girl for a while, and half of her body gradually became transparent. Because of some special reasons, she said. Special reasons? I heard that the Silver Elves would bury their greatest heroes with their ancient kings. Amandina recited the words from the book, but she looked at the little girl suspiciously. No matter how she looked at her, she did not look like the greatest hero. The elf girl stroked her unicorn and her eyes became gentle. It's not like that, I'm actually here on behalf of someone else. What? Brando almost spat out a second mouthful of water. In that era he had heard of people taking exams on behalf of others, but he had never heard of people occupying tombs on behalf of others. What is this? Waiting in line? But Amandina was much sharper than him and she immediately asked, dying on behalf of others? Or buried with others? Brando was stunned. Substitute. He thought to himself. What a ridiculous development. Who would have thought that the noble and elegant Silver Elves would do such a thing? They look no different from humans. But the elf girl immediately shook her head. I'm here of my own accord. Of your own accord? Brando was in disbelief. A faint smile appeared on the elf girl's face as if she thought of something proud. I'm here on behalf of my sister, no, for the princess. When she said this, the lower half of her body was almost transparent to the point where it was almost invisible. Wait. Brando interrupted her. Sister? Your Highness, what's going on? My mother is an elven artisan of Cheryl Village. But my father is the Emperor of the Heron Empire. I think I can be considered half a princess. So your sister is the princess of the Silver Elves Empire? The girl nodded. What's going on? My sister was cursed by the Myrna people during the battle. The court mage said to my father that unless someone related to her by blood died in her place, she would be weak for the rest of her life until she died. The elf girl slowly narrated, but my sister is the most outstanding general in the Empire. No matter if it's the dwarves, the human allies, or our people, no one wants this to happen. So, my father chose me. Amandina frowned. He's your father, how could he do such a thing? But Brando held her back. She did not understand how powerful the Dark Dragon was in the Year of Chaos. Every race paid a huge price to fight against that existence. Medicia's father was the ruler of the Heron Empire, so it was normal for him to make such a choice. He looked at the elf girl and was silent for a while. Then he asked, why are you telling us this? Because I want to ask you for a favor? As expected, Brando thought. What favor? The lizard men in the forest took my sister's necklace from my tomb. I don't know what they want to do with it. But without that item, the curse won't be able to stay on me. I'm worried. Amandina was depressed and could not help but interrupt her. You're going to disappear and you're still worried about others. The elven girl glanced at the noble's daughter and smiled. Because of this, I hope that my disappearance will be more meaningful. Amandina was speechless. This is your own matter, we have the right to refuse, right? Brando asked again. Even though his rationality told him to accept this request, he did not know why, but he was a little angry when he saw this girl who seemed to be aloof from worldly affairs. The girl looked up and her eyes flashed with a hint of slyness. Human? Sir, you're here to seek the help of the ancient kings, right? Her body was almost completely transparent. You know? I can hear even the slightest breeze in the valley. She closed her eyes and answered, But in order to obtain the recognition of the ancient kings, you must first obtain my recognition. So, I want to make a deal with you. He was actually threatened, and by a little girl at that. Brando felt bitter. Could he turn against her? He looked back at Amandina and the Roman, and the two girls and the Nightsong Tiger nodded. All right, but I have a request. Brando said, I want to obtain the help of the ancient kings. Otherwise, using our strength to deal with the lizard men bandits in the forest is no different from throwing an egg at a rock. The girl nodded. I've already agreed. She answered. Brando was surprised. You're not worried that I'll go back on my word? Of course. I'm worried. The elf girl was silent for a moment before she answered. Then why? The girl suddenly coughed. She looked up again and her face was full of tears. Of course I'm worried. But I don't want to disappear. I still have things to do. I'm sorry, can you help me? The wind in the mountains blew past the top of the forest, and a sobbing sound could be heard from afar. Everyone was stunned at that moment. Although she had clearly disappeared without a trace, the last words of the elven girl's sobbing seemed to linger in everyone's ears. Brando looked back at the others, and for a moment he could not say a word. P.S. Fourth update, carrying the silver elf lowly on my back for support. To be continued. If you want to know the future, please go to www.gdn.com. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 163. Her sobs were carried away by the wind, and the forest returned to silence. Brendel sighed. He turned around and saw the hope in Romain and Amandina's eyes. Even though they were enemies just a moment ago, everything that happened before was not Melissa's fault. Moreover, the elven girl's background was truly pitiful. She's a girl with a soft heart. Even though they were enemies just a moment ago, everything that happened before was not her fault. You want to save her? Romain nodded her head like she was pounding garlic. Amandina was slightly more reserved after hearing Brendel's words. She bit her lips and wanted to say something, but every time she wanted to say something she would swallow it back down. My lord. The Nightsong Tiger spoke from the other side. Brando was surprised. He did not expect the Nightsong Tiger to speak. He could not help but ask in surprise, You're a mercenary. The Nightsong Tiger immediately shut his mouth, but his voice immediately sounded in his mind. My lord, this is an opportunity. As a planeswalker, my lord does not have a high-quality card. The elven girl is very strong, and if you seal her, it is not impossible to create a high-quality card. That would require her to be willing. Brando replied in his mind. In fact, he had thought of this method from the beginning. Creating blank cards was a basic skill for a planeswalker, but with Brando's current strength, he could only create a contract card that consumed 100 wealth and a small amount of mana. These cards could only be used when the sealing party was extremely weak and willing. 100 wealth might be a drop in the ocean for a veteran planeswalker, but for Brando, it was just enough for a month's worth of savings. If Metisha did not agree, then he would lose 100 wealth for nothing. It was impossible to say that he did not feel the pain. The Nightsong Tiger looked at the merchant lady and Amandina, and looked at Brando's hopeful expression. He knew his lord's choice. The middle-aged mercenary smiled slightly and replied in his mind, But if I don't try, I will feel uneasy. Brando could not help but smile awkwardly. That was indeed the case, but rather than saying that he did not want to disappoint Roman and Amandina, it was more accurate to say that he did not want to disappoint himself. What happened in his previous life was destined to be unchangeable, but it might not be the case in this life. Because he was here, he believed that his inexplicable arrival in this world was not without meaning. 100 wealth. Not only was he giving Metisha a chance, but he was also giving himself a chance. From this point of view, it was definitely worth it. He pulled out a blank card from his deck. There wasn't much of a difference between a blank card and a card of fate. The only difference was that the front of the card was blank, like an empty room waiting for a guest. What's that? Roman asked curiously when he saw the card that Brando took out. My lord is saving the little elf girl, the Nightsong Tiger replied. He's engraving her soul into the card to stabilize her soul fire. Amandina's eyes flashed. It sounds like a summoner's ability, but don't summoners use crystals? How can they seal souls that aren't monsters? It can also be considered as a type of summoning ability. The Nightsong Tiger replied. But it's also a last resort because it's the only way. I can't think of any other way to keep this little girl in this world. Amandina and Roman nodded. They could understand Brando's actions. After all, the destruction of the soul fire meant the complete loss of existence. The energy would be reduced to the most basic elements and scattered throughout the world, and would not return to the embrace of Gaia in the normal sense. Such a method of disappearance was the most painful for any living being, let alone the highly intelligent elves. Brando showed the card to the empty space. Medisha, are you willing to travel with me and become a part of the laws of this world? He opened his mouth, and it was as if there was a voice in his heart that spoke at the same time. The blank card flew out from his hand and floated in the air. Brando waited for a response, but there was no response even after a minute. He sighed in pity and almost thought that Medisha had disappeared. But at this time a small voice suddenly spoke. I have a wish, can it be granted? Brando. No, Lord Planeswalker. It was Medisha's voice. Brando sighed heavily. Of course, Miss Medisha. Please speak. Travel with you. Want to see my sister. Just once is enough. The small voice replied. Brando was taken aback. He thought it was some kind of request. Even if it was absolute freedom, it was not impossible for him to accept it. But he did not expect Medisha's wish to be so simple. The Silver Elves lived for a long time. This elven girl's father and sister might still be alive at this time, so this wish was not unattainable. It was just that it was a little troublesome because they had hidden away from the world. So he thought for a moment and nodded. A black light flashed on the card, and then he saw a row of words appear on his retina. The contract is established. Then another prompt appeared. A new deck has been discovered, please name it, Eternal Song. Since it was a silver elf, he should name it after the silver elf's most famous army in ancient times. Brando thought. After the light on the card faded, it fell down to his hand. Brando picked up the card. On the card was a female knight wearing silver armor and holding a shuttle-shaped spear with a gentle smile. It was Medisha. Unicorn Knight, Eternal Song I, Dark 15, Creature, Heroic Spirit Knight, Level 35 Elite, put Unicorn Knight Medisha New Moon into the field. Maintenance cost, when Medisha New Moon is in the field, pay Dark 1/6 of wealth per day. The elven flag flutters high, the heart shines, the sword shines. Brando held the card and did not know what to do for a moment. The card responded with a cold touch, proving that it was not a normal card. Brando also thought about how high the quality of Medisha's sealed card could be. After all, she was an existence that had entered the gold tier. But he did not expect it to be a silver tier card. An ancient item. Other than the Sword of Light, this was the second ancient item he had obtained. Tumen had told him that the cards of fate were much rarer than magic items of the same tier, so he had thought about what the second ancient item he could obtain would be. But he had never thought that it would be a card of fate. But reality had given him a heavy blow. Now it seemed that he did not lose that 100 wealth. Instead, he made a huge profit. Brando wanted to laugh out loud, if not for the fact that he had to maintain his image in front of his subordinates. He had always had a headache because of the various powerful enemies he encountered. He even thought that he was cursed in this life, or else why would he have to do things that were beyond his level? First, he fought Madara's army as a newbie. Then he defeated the White Knight before reaching level 15. Then he played a race of life and death with the Crusader Executioner in Brax. Not to mention the gold tier, Turst of All for one. Then after a few months of leisure he had to fight Buga again. Then in less than 3 days the Tree Herders, the Oracle and the Ghost Knight came out one after another. It was simply unbearable. Although he did not fear All for One, Tree Herders, Madara or other terrorist organizations like All for One, he did not fear the feeling of being watched by strong enemies all the time. Trust me, it was definitely not a good feeling. But now it was different. He had a gold tier follower. Even if it was only a gold tier follower, at least in the southern part of Erewhon, he could do whatever he wanted. No matter how powerful the Tree Herders and All for One were, they could not send a gold tier assassin to kill him, right? That was a method used by these two organizations to deal with enemies of the Count level and above. Brando did not think that he had reached that level yet. Moreover, even if a gold tier opponent came with his experience and Medisha's strength, it would be easy to deal with the problem. It was better than him, who was not even a silver tier, having to bite the bullet, right? All in all, at this moment, he felt that the dark clouds had parted and the sun was shining. This is the feeling of riding on someone's coattails. Good people have good karma. Brando could not help but think to himself. Then he turned his head and held back his laughter as he waved the card of fate in his hand to the others. Done, everyone. Amandina and Roman's eyes lit up, especially Romaine, who could not help but urge, "That's great, Brando. Quickly summon Medisha and let us take a look." Ahem. Brando coughed and his expression changed. Roman's words could be said to have poked at his sore spot. Although the Unicorn Knight card was a divine artifact to him at this moment, there was a problem that he had to face. The summoning cost of this card was a full 15 points of Dark EP. Moreover, there was a high 6 points of wealth and 1 point of Dark EP daily maintenance fee. Not to mention where Brando was going to find so many Dark EP, just the 6 points of wealth daily maintenance fee was enough to make him bankrupt. The rich gold mine card that he had attached to the Sacred Tree's secret ground only brought in 4 points of wealth daily, and he still had to deduct 2 points of Mercenaries of Lopez maintenance fee. If he added Medusa into the equation, he would need at least 2 gold mines to make up for it. Brando could not help but smack his forehead. Only now did he know that salt and rice were expensive. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com to read more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 164. It took a lot of effort to explain the summoning rules of the Cards of Fates to Romain and Amandina. After explaining that he was temporarily unable to summon Medusa, Brendel's identity as a planeswalker was also revealed. Fortunately, the perceptive noble lady didn't suspect the Mercenaries of Lopez for the time being. After all, it was too unimaginable. However, Brando was not worried that they would find out the truth. The reason was simple: the only person Amandina could rely on was him. He believed that he had the ability to make her trust him. Of course, this was nonsense. Brando thought to himself that he had been in this world for 500 years and 100 years. If he still could not deceive a little girl, then he would not be worthy of being called a hardcore gaming nerd in his previous life. He put away the Unicorn Knight card and then ordered 2 mercenaries to investigate in the direction of the temple. At the same time, a few mercenaries had already brought him the spoils of war. As the Ghost Knight, Medusa only left behind 2 items, a pair of boots and a crystal. When Brando saw the crystal, he almost thought that his eyes were playing tricks on him. However, he rubbed his eyes to make sure that he was not dreaming. No, this must be a dream. Otherwise, how could he, who was known as the unlucky king in the game, encounter such good things one after another? Just like the last time when he did not obtain the heart of the tree from the Golden Tree boss, he was not surprised at all because of his good karma. It was normal that he did not get anything good. If he did get something good, then it must be an illusion. But after he confirmed it again, he had to admit that the crystal in the Mercenaries of Lopez hands was indeed the Ghost Knight's crystal. The Ghost Knight's crystal, enhanced item, arm, increases damage by plus 10% after equipping. Brando pinched Roman's face. The latter immediately raised her eyebrows in protest. What are you doing, Brando? Although she knew that this level of protest was nothing to Brando, he really hurt her this time. She could not help but complain loudly. No, I'm just making sure that I'm not dreaming. Brando replied as if he was sleepwalking. Pinch yourself, damn it. Roman was so angry that he lifted his boots and kicked him. This time, Brando knew that he was not dreaming because of the pain. Hiss. Serves you right. Roman, you're not allowed to wear boots next time. No way. Amandina couldn't help but shake her head as she looked at the 2 of them who had suddenly become like children. She saw the mercenaries snickering and knew that their lord must be in a good mood to be like this. However, when she looked at the crystal, she wondered if it was really that important. This is the Ghost Knight's crystal? As she thought about this, she couldn't help but ask her question. Not only her, but the others were not idiots, especially the Nightsong Tiger. They were all waiting for Brando to tell them what the crystal was for. In their hearts, Brando's knowledge was already common knowledge, so they were not surprised. Hearing the noble's question, Brando stopped. He nodded and replied, Yes, this is the Ghost Knight's crystal. Then he could not help but smile. It seems that my prophecy came true. A day trip to Ampere Seal is inevitable. Compared to the value of the crystal itself, the mercenaries were obviously more willing to hear this. They did not understand what a prophecy meant, but a day trip to Ampere Seal was easy to understand. Hearing this, they could not help but cheer in unison. Although it was a creature summoned by a card, it still had its own memories and feelings. But Amandina did not care about this. Ampere Seal was Erewhon's largest free port. When she was very young, she went there with her father once, but other than the prosperity, it did not leave a deep impression. But when she remembered her irresponsible father, she could not help but deliberately avoid this thought and asked, Is this crystal really that important? Of course. Brando answered matter-of-factly, his tone was so indisputable. As an item that appeared in the previous versions of the Amber Sword, it could still be sold for a sky-high price of 300 million tor in the later stages of the game. Even if it was converted to RMB, it could be sold for 3 to 4,000 tor on the trading platform. One had to know that this was just a virtual strengthening gem, so the value of this thing was obvious. The enhancement crystal was a type of implant, and a level 20 character could have 3 spots to enhance: arms, head and torso. Because the enhancement crystal was an item that could not be lost in the game, its value was often higher than normal equipment. Of course, in this world, this advantage had lost its value, but it did not change its value. At least, from the lesson of the Thorn of Light, the enhancement crystal could not be lost. Damage output was explosive power, and increasing explosive power by 10% was equivalent to increasing offensive power by the same amount. Because Brando had enough experience to push Strength Burst to level 10 when he leveled up, his explosive power could reach 30 ounces when he activated it, and this crystal could provide him with a 10% increase in strength, which was equivalent to 3 ounces. After reaching level 20, the power of 3 ounces was equivalent to that of an ancient item. Moreover, this was only the early stages. What would it be like when he had a few hundred OZ in the later stages? Brando could imagine how much this thing could bring him. If this thing has a price, Brando smiled and said as he picked up the crystal, then it's worth 300 million. 300 million. The mercenaries' faces turned green. If Brando said that this thing was worth 3 million, they might have felt their breathing quicken. However, 300 million was the annual revenue of a wealthy duchy. These mercenaries who were born commoners didn't know how to react to this number. They could only think that Brando was joking. Not only them, even the Roman did not believe him. Amandina lightly snorted and glared at Brando. Amandina furrowed her brows, thinking that this guy was boasting again. But Brando did not care whether these people believed him or not. He happily implanted this thing into his right hand, and it immediately flowed into his body through the crystal. But he was already used to this feeling in the game, so he casually picked up the pair of metal shin guards. However, as soon as he picked it up, he almost screamed and threw it away. Flesh shin guard, brass, plus 10. 5% movement speed, plus 5 vitality, level requirement, 20. Equipment level, 20 ounces. Brando suddenly felt that the world was a little unreal, even though this world was not real to him. But was this a sign of the end of the world? He definitely did not believe that he would be promoted to the legendary face fighter one day. A Spectre Knight crystal and 8 brass equipment. After all, it was only an elite quest boss. It wasn't even considered a boss. He was stunned for a moment, but he immediately remembered something. Who was the one who went to loot the corpse? He hurriedly asked. Loot the corpse? Everyone was stunned. What did that mean? But when Brando saw the expressions of his subordinates, he realized that he had said something wrong. In a moment of panic, he even blurted out, "Loot the corpse." He hurriedly coughed and corrected himself. I meant, who was the one who went to clean up the battlefield? This question was a little complicated. Was there a need to pay special attention to cleaning up the battlefield? The mercenaries looked at each other and there was a moment of silence. But finally a voice spoke. It was me, my lord. What's the matter? The voice was a little cold. Brando turned his head and saw that it was the elder sister of the Elementalist sisters. She raised her head to look at him, but it was difficult to hide the trace of nervousness in her eyes. When Brando spoke so hurriedly, it was inevitable that she would think that she had done something wrong. Nothing, Brando nodded. In the future, the task of cleaning up the battlefield will be handed over to you. Meh. The elven lady was stunned. She held back and pressed one hand to her chest and asked again. Anyone could see that this was a rare honor, but she did not understand what she had done to attract the Lord's favor. She thought for a long time, and could only think of some bad habits of some nobles, so she could not help but look at Brando with a little suspicion. But Brando was not in the mood to explain to her. He was only secretly happy in his heart. I used to lead a group with bad hands, but now I finally have a good hand and a soft girl at that. Just looking at her is pleasing to the eye. In the game, the flesh armor was the standard equipment for a meat shield. Brando wanted to turn the most experienced mercenary leader, the Nightsong Tiger, into a meat shield, but the creatures summoned by cards could not use items outside of the rules. Although these mercenaries could pick up a long sword and shoot with a longbow, they could not enjoy the benefits of magic items. If they wanted to equip a piece of equipment, they could only use the method of attaching. For example, if Brando attached the Holy Sword card to the mercenaries of Lopez, it meant that he could designate one of the mercenaries to wield all the effects of the Holy Sword card. Of course, he still had to pay for it himself. On the other hand, the Roman and Amandina were not combat members, so of course they did not need this pair of flesh armor. Brando had no choice but to wear it himself. To be honest, he could not help but feel a little guilty. If he did this in the game, he would probably see a post on the forums by tomorrow morning. 2 or 3 things I know about the hairy man Brando, Captain Brando. At this time, the 2 mercenaries that were sent out to investigate the shrine came back from afar. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com to read more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 165. In the temple of the elven goddess Shay, the sealed altar was opened again after nearly 2 centuries. Brando saw tall elves with cold expressions, long silver hair tied behind their heads, silver-pointed helmets, double-ended swords in their hands, and pure white silver-plated armor on their bodies. They walked down from the obsidian altar with large strides. Their faces were cold and their long silver hair was tied behind their heads. They wore silver-pointed helmets that protected their faces, and they held double-ended swords in their hands. They were pure white chainmail armor that was plated with silver. The Silver Elves were known as the strongest heavy infantry in the continent. The Elven Guards. 20 Silver Elves appeared on the altar one after another. They all nodded at Brando and stood neatly on both sides of the altar. Finally, a faint shadow appeared in the center of the temple. It was like a spirit that was slowly taking shape. Clang. The mercenaries behind Brando unsheathed their swords. But Brando was not nervous. He could guess what was going on and nodded slightly. Under everyone's nervous gazes, the blurry figure gradually became clearer. Facial features gradually emerged from the white shadow. Finally, an adult elf wearing a silver robe with silver hair and silver eyes, and even his skin was light silver in color, appeared in front of everyone. He raised his chin and looked at everyone with an indifferent gaze. He was taller than everyone in Brando's group. Even among the Silver Elves he was considered tall and sturdy. The Silver Elf glanced at everyone with a stern gaze. Even the Nightsong Tiger could not help but lower his head in fear. Even though it was just a blurry figure, everyone held their breaths as they felt the strength of the person in front of them. The first and only possibility they thought of was that this was one of the ancient kings of the Silver Elves. The Silver Elf thought for a moment and asked, "You are all humans?" Everyone, including Brando, nodded. "Who is he?" Amandina could not help but whisper to Brando's back. "I think he is the first king of the Silver Elves, Azoth. I have seen his face in the engravings before." Brando blurted out. The holographic image of the 11th king of the Silver Elves could be found on the forums. Brando was certain of it, but he could not say it out loud. Otherwise he would be labeled as a fraud. But just as he finished speaking, the giant elf lowered his head and looked at Brando. "You know me?" Brando could only nod. What else could he do? The ancient Silver Elves had all experienced the War of the Holy Saints. They came from the Age of Chaos, the Age of Chaos. One had to know that in that era, there were still golden bloodlines walking on the earth. The various races were all descendants of the Silver bloodline, and there were countless powerful individuals. For someone like Medisa who had the strength of a gold-ranked warrior, it might seem inconceivable in the present day, but at that time, there were plenty of them. The forum had estimated the levels of a series of powerhouses in that era. The conclusion was that the 4 holy saints were at least level 180 and above. The leaders of the dwarves, humans, and elves at that time were probably not lower than level 150. As for elemental activation, it was the basic requirement for a warrior. Those below gold were cannon fodder. All in all, it was a mythical era. Of course, these estimates were based on fragmentary information. There might be some errors, but Brando thought that even if there were, it would not be too far off. Just like this Azoth in front of him. He was just a shadow standing here, but the pressure he gave him almost made him unable to breathe. His experience was that of a level 130 warrior. He could not be compared to the Roman and Amandina. The Silver Elf King Azotha's soul pondered for a moment and said, "Thank you for the child Medisha. But on the other hand, you came here to ask for something, right?" Brando nodded again. Didn't Medisha say that it would be fine as long as she agreed? Why did this Azoth come out? Could it be that the little girl was lying? But Medisha had become his summoning card now. It seemed like he could not find her even if he wanted to denounce her. But Azoth paused for a moment and continued, "So what help do you want, former ally?" The Elf King's voice was very low. It seemed that he was not used to the modern crew's language, so he spoke very slowly. But everyone understood the meaning of his words. They were stunned. So easy to talk to? But Brando understood that the problem was not that simple. But he still answered honestly, I want to deal with the lizard men bandits in the forest. On the one hand, I want to fulfill Medisha's wish. I hope to get your help. This is a battle between the living. How can the dead interfere? Azoth asked. Damn. Cunning old fox. Brando cursed in his heart but still answered, No, this has something to do with you. What does it have to do with? Brando raised his head. For the first time he had the courage to look into Azoth's eyes. Those lizard men, I'm afraid, are related to the tree herders. Tree herders? Azoth asked in a low voice. After the War of the Holy Saints, the Darkness Dragon was imprisoned forever. The Myrnas were also driven to the northern tundra by our ancestor, the Flame King Gretel. Everyone said that no one saw them after that, but they have always existed. Brando spoke frankly. They scattered and integrated into the human world. They called themselves the Tree Herders, the Silver Sky Serpents, and secretly engaged in activities to subvert civilization. They were preparing to seek the Darkness Dragon's return. Amandina suddenly exclaimed. She looked at Brando in surprise. Of course she knew about the Myrnas, but she did not expect the Tree Herders to be the legendary Dark Ones. She also did not expect Brando to know about this. And he seemed to have known about it for a long time. But weren't these things very dangerous? If Brando knew, then there was no reason for the high-ranking nobles not to know. Why didn't they have the intention to completely expel these organizations? Of course she did not think that Brando was lying. No one dared to lie in front of the Elven King. But if the Myrna still existed, then what about the Darkness Dragon? Was it really like what Brando said, that it was also welcoming the return of the Darkness Dragon? The previous Dark Age was the War of the Holy Saints that lasted for nearly 7 centuries. That was a chaotic time like hell. She did not dare to imagine that the world would return to that kind of chaos. Moreover, the Golden Bloodline that fought against the Darkness Dragon had disappeared, and the Silver Clan was declining day by day. How could they, the Bronze and Iron clans, save the world again? Amandina's face could not help but turn a little pale. After listening to Brando's words, Azadin raised his silver eyebrows. Those remnants of the darkness are still active? He sighed. Guilt is too soft-hearted. I warned him when I was still alive. It's a pity that this young man did not listen to me in the end. But perhaps it is because of this that he can be called a king. Brando did not speak, but Roman, the Nightsong Tiger, Amandina, and the others were shocked to the point that they could not speak. In the end, it was the younger of the Elementalist sisters who stuttered, Lord Azadin, you said that the Flame King Guilt is soft-hearted? Brando looked at them and knew why they were so surprised. The Flame King Guilt was known for his coldness and ruthlessness in history. This emperor who single-handedly established human civilization was the last of the Holy Saints, and was also one of the 4 Holy Saints. Most of the rumors about him were about how he cold-bloodedly established his own dynasty, and how he drove the Myrnas to the harsh north. But Brando knew that the real history of the players was not like this, but it was not convenient for him to say more. In order to prevent the topic from being diverted, he had to interrupt the question. The lizard men are here to spy on the king's tomb. From Medisha's words, they must have been near the temple more than once. Your Majesty, you have been sleeping here for generations, so you must be aware of everything around you. Also then finally nodded. He glanced at the 2 little wild elves. Although he could tell that they were elves, the silver bloodline was too scattered back then, so he couldn't tell which bloodline these 2 little girls came from. So, Brando answered, and the young man's face quickly showed a confident smile. Azadin also showed a gentle smile for the first time, but it quickly disappeared and became cold again. Even though it is almost impossible for the creatures of darkness to break through Lady Martha's holy domain, the sacred oath of the past is still valid. In the path of fighting against the darkness, we will always stand together as allies of the humans. Thank you sincerely. Brando put his hand in front of his chest and bowed. He had learned how to deal with these high-level NPCs in the game. Then what should we do? Amandina finally mustered up the courage to interject at this time. She looked at Brando and saw encouragement in his eyes. My guards, I will lend them to you. Azadin answered. They were the most valiant warriors of the Silver Elves when they were alive, and after they died, they swore to fight against the darkness forever. They will go with you and help you clear out all the enemies in the darkness, but the altar is weakening day by day, and they cannot leave this area, nor can they project for too long. Finally, he paused for a moment. Treat Medisha well, she is a pitiful child. The Elven Emperor said softly. Amandina, Brando, and Roman nodded in unison. Amandina quickly turned her head and whispered to Brando, He trusts us that much? She thought that there would at least be a test or something, but she did not expect Azadin to be so easygoing. Of course, Brando's expression was solemn as he whispered, "You don't understand under what kind of circumstances the alliance between the humans and the races were signed in the era where they lived. The agreement that was called the Sacred Covenant almost did not involve any benefits, and was purely an agreement made for survival. In that era, the races that fought against the Dark Dragon's rule were as close as brothers, or else there was no need to continue the war." "Are you talking about the War of the Holy Saints?" Amandina asked softly. Brando nodded. But suddenly his heart skipped a beat, and he frowned and immediately turned his head in a certain direction. He immediately saw the Nightsong Tiger's eyes with the same expression. The mercenary leader did not say a word, and only whispered to him in his mind, "Card resonance." To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com to read more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 166. The battle was long over, and Conrad and the Dark Bishop of the Disciples of the Black Flames were patrolling the battlefield. White smoke rose from the ashes and there were corpses everywhere. The corpses of disciples in black robes, demons and mercenaries were still alive in this world not long ago. Now, after the blood in their bodies cooled down, their skin became something like glue, like a pile of molds. He took a few steps forward and flipped over the corpse of a mercenary in leather armor. The mercenary groaned, and the demon leader frowned and ended his life with a stab. Conrad raised his head and said impatiently, "No, the only son of Duke Lone is not here. That bastard Makarov, since you know him so well, why did you come here to fight?" The Dark Bishop replied with a gloomy voice, "We lost a lot of men because of that tall bastard beside Makarov. How can you reap the rewards if you don't invest?" Conrad raised his head and smiled, licking his lips. He pulled out a blood-stained sword from the corpse and pointed at his subordinates, "Bring the rest of the captives here." A few trembling Grey Wolves mercenaries were quickly brought forward. In the previous battle, these people had fought like the most courageous warriors. But outside of the battle, the halo known as courage was taken away. They found that they had no power to resist, especially after seeing the bloody scene of their companions being swallowed alive by the demons. Only then did they realize that their strength was not enough to control fate. Once they understood this, the fear of the unknown gripped their hearts. One of them was the white-haired youth who Brendel was familiar with. He looked at his companions with disdain as they turned pale with fright. He stayed behind to cover Yura's escape, so it was expected that he would be captured. He raised his head and looked at the man called Conrad. They thought that he was just the leader of the Paper Cards mercenaries, their sworn enemy, but Brando was right. Not only were they in cahoots with the disciples of the Black Flames, they were also the lackeys of the tree herders. The guy called Conrad was about the same age as Brando. Whenever he thought of that fellow, his teeth would itch. Ever since he was young, other than his father, no one had dared to lecture him like that. This was simply a type of humiliation, and it made him gnash his teeth in anger. At that moment, Rady had already viewed the man in front of him as the same type of person as Brando. He looked at him with the most disdainful gaze in an attempt to infuriate him. "As long as he comes looking for trouble with me, I can humiliate him and show those useless fellows the courage of the Grey Wolves mercenaries." He had such a plan in his heart, but he didn't expect Conrad to be slightly startled when he saw the look in his eyes. Then he just smiled. He shifted his gaze and looked at the other mercenary. "Looking down on me?" Lady was furious. He struggled to rush over. However, with the dark mercenary pressing down on her shoulder, she couldn't move at all. Even if she wanted to curse, she couldn't because her mouth was tied with something. She could only let out muffled sounds. He saw Conrad walk to the mercenary on the far right and whisper something to him. The mercenary was stunned for a moment before he shook his head with difficulty. He originally thought that Conrad would at least interrogate him, but he didn't expect that the demon would just shake his head and drag his companion away. Lady couldn't see what was behind him, but from the miserable screams of the mercenary, he could imagine that it was definitely not a good place to be taken away. Then he heard a series of crashing sounds, as if the bones were being pulled out of the flesh and the organs were slipping out of the body. The miserable screams gradually lost their strength and turned into howls. Finally, it turned into a hoarse sound followed by a low growl. The sound finally disappeared, but the remaining mercenaries couldn't help but shiver. Then Conrad walked to the next mercenary and asked something. That mercenary was actually scared silly. He knelt on the ground and couldn't say a word. The young mercenary leader shook his head regretfully and stood up. He looked at the mercenary who was backing away and stabbed his sword into the mercenary's eye before kicking him away. He clapped his hands and ordered his subordinates to drag the corpse away. There were only 3 mercenaries left, including Lady. The white-haired youth saw that his 2 companions were scared out of their wits. It was as if they just remembered that they were only doing this for a living. Their previous glory, faith, and pride from the glorious achievements of the Grey Wolves mercenaries had all crumbled at that moment. They shivered and their faces were pale as they realized that they only wanted to live. Lady looked at his companions, who used to be incomparably proud of themselves in the face of life and death. But now they were acting like cowards. He couldn't help but curse them in his heart. However, he was also cursing Conrad. "Come and find me if you have the ability, you bastard." Reedy was unable to speak and could only speak from his heart. Reedy had never wanted to show off so much before. It was just death, right? He wanted to show his companions, who were completely controlled by fear, that there was nothing to be afraid of in death. The most humiliating thing was to submit to the enemy. However, Conrad didn't seem to hear him. He only took the mercenaries away one by one. It was as if he didn't want to get any information. He didn't even ask any questions. Even if the last mercenary knelt down and begged for mercy and swore that he wanted to join them and was willing to tell them everything he knew, he would only be dragged away. Soon only Lady was left. Conrad stopped in front of him. The white-haired youth didn't react at first and just pounced on him like a mad dog. However, his chest immediately suffered a heavy blow, and he was kicked back like a stray dog, rolling a few times. He then crawled up with his face covered in dirt. He was the only one left. After realizing this, his heart sank uncontrollably. Was there no one left to appreciate his bravery? Who was he trying to show it to? The enemy? But looking at Conrad's cold face and the dark bishop's expression, it was obvious that they wouldn't appreciate his bravery. A bone-piercing chill enveloped his body. Lady suddenly shivered. He thought of a problem. Was he going to die here without knowing why? Was he going to end up like those unsightly fellows? But how could he do that? He was Lady, the most outstanding youth in the mercenary group other than Eek. If he died here like those cold corpses, who would know that he was once a hero? No, he couldn't die like that. But there was no one left to record it. How he wished that there was someone hiding in the forest. Or someone else playing dead on the battlefield. Reedy subconsciously told himself that he wasn't afraid of death. Death was nothing. He just didn't want to die like those meaningless fellows. But he knew that was destined to be an extravagant hope. In front of the disciples of the Black Flames, other than the leader and Buga, no one else could hide in the forest. Thinking about that, he couldn't help but feel conflicted. He wavered between death and a more meaningful death, and his expression kept changing. Conrad stared coldly at the youth and did not say a single word. Then he pulled out the dagger from the bishop's waist. Reedy shuddered as he finally realized that death was approaching. But he didn't expect Conrad to not say a word. He was a bastard, the descendant of the knight Marco, the descendant of the Erewhon nobles. He struggled, but he immediately felt the cold blade of the dagger against his neck. No, he didn't want to die. Lady's heart finally showed despair at the last moment. The will to struggle in his eyes naturally disappeared. None of this escaped the young leader's eyes. Conrad immediately withdrew his dagger and pulled down the white-haired youth's mask. He asked, "Do you want to die?" Lady opened his mouth and wanted to say a few harsh words, but he found that he was trembling and couldn't say a word. In the end, he could only silently nod. But he suddenly reacted and quickly shook his head. Then he felt his face heat up. It wasn't because he was weak, but because he was so frightened that he couldn't even hear what Conrad said. What a disgrace. Then let me ask you a question. Conrad straightened his body and looked down at the youth. The other group that came with you, how many people did they have in total and where did they go? Lady was stunned. If this demon wanted him to reveal the core information of the Grey Wolves mercenaries, he felt that he wouldn't be able to do so. But since Conrad mentioned that group of people, it meant that they had a common enemy. For a moment, the white-haired youth subconsciously closed the distance between them and faintly saw them as a group. He didn't think that he was surrendering and at most they were cooperating. That bastard actually dared to teach him a lesson. He gritted his teeth as he thought. They left towards the northeast before you attacked. There were a total of 15 people, and the leader was a young man about the same age as you. There were 2 women with him. He had 12 guards. Lady paused. They seemed to be at least silver ranked. I only knew this when I eavesdropped on your conversation with Buga. He didn't even need Conrad's reminder to sell out Brando in an orderly manner. If Brando was here, he would probably be so angry that he would laugh. He only punched Lady once and Conrad even kicked him like he was a dog. Lady seemed to have forgotten all about it. Conrad and the Dark Bishop beside him looked at each other. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 167. After Rady finished speaking, no one interrupted him. Under the night sky, a cool breeze swept across the battlefield, and the air was filled with the smell of blood. The demonic leader of the paper cards and the Dark Bishop stood quietly in the wind, as if they were digesting the information contained in Rady's words. Conrad raised his head and smiled faintly. He seemed to be praising the young man's cooperation, but he was always praising him, whether it was his death or his obedience. 12 silver-ranked guards. He repeated the white-haired young man's words. What do you think? 12? The Dark Bishop raised his head slightly. It seems possible. Even if it's a trap, it's a fact that the young man is not part of Makarov's main force. No, don't doubt it anymore. Being indecisive will only ruin things. Conrad waved his hand and interrupted him, turning back to the young man kneeling on the ground. Are you a noble from the kingdom of unyielding skies? Rady was stunned for a moment before he quickly nodded. Good, it seems like you are more valuable than those people. Conrad laughed like a demon. We don't need worthless people, so they were dealt with. However, you are different. You have a strong will and know what you need. The Grey Wolves mercenaries are done for, and a wise man submits to circumstances. Are you willing to work with us? The white-haired young man raised his head and was stunned for a moment. He did not understand what Conrad meant. Of course, he was also afraid that this demonic person would take a mile after taking an inch. Conrad had mentioned his identity before, and he was afraid that he would be implicated. However, Conrad's words were very clear. If he refused, he would end up like those useless fellows. Rady couldn't help but feel conflicted once more. He had already betrayed his conscience once. At that moment he was like a businessman who was losing money. He had invested more money in the hopes of recouping his losses, but now he realized that the money he had invested was going to be wasted. He subconsciously did not want such a thing to happen. Conrad had given him a final straw to clutch at, and he only hesitated for a moment before he clenched his teeth and grabbed it. Even if he was going to die, it would be a matter for the future. The young mercenary leader smiled. All right, I'll lend you a person. No, a team of people. Now, lead them to chase after those 15 fellows. You don't have to kill them. Of course, if you can really do it, I will give you my position as guild leader. Conrad leaned down and patted Qin Xiaoyan's face. Don't worry, I will not lie to you. After all, I have to go to other places after completing this mission. However, Rady didn't hear him clearly. When the white-haired young man heard that he was only going to hunt down Brando, he couldn't help but heave a sigh of relief. Originally, he was already prepared to cut his wrist, but of course, it would be best if he didn't have to. At this moment he couldn't help but rejoice, rejoicing that he had made the right choice. Not to mention the tempting conditions. Although the paper cards mercenaries were not as famous as the Grey Wolves mercenaries, they were still one of the top mercenary groups in the southern region. Rady couldn't help but feel excited when he thought about the possibility of becoming a commander. But when he raised his head he was startled. This was because he saw the man dressed in black priest robes move to the side, revealing a figure shrouded in a long black cloak and shrouded in black mist. Rady was stunned for a moment, but he still recognized the person from the cloak's weapon. Scarlet? Oh, so she's called Scarlet? The dark priest laughed sinisterly. Then let's call her that for now. I don't have any talent for naming anyway. Once you complete this mission she will be yours. The white-haired young man's Adam's apple bobbed, and his hands subconsciously tightened. He liked the red-haired girl, and that was a fact that everyone in the mercenary group knew. However, Scarlet only had feelings for Eek and the others were just like siblings. Rady knew this, but he still had some extravagant hopes. He hoped that after Eek and Yura's wedding he would have a chance. But he knew that the chances of that happening were slim. He took a deep breath. Although the current Scarlet looked a little different from the girl in the past, it didn't matter. He suddenly remembered Conrad's words. The Grey Wolves mercenaries were done for, but he knew that Yura was still alive. In fact, very few people knew that he liked Scarlet and he was also spying on the blind girl. But that was a non-existent hypothesis, so he kept his ambitions to himself. However, at this moment, the beast hidden in his heart seemed to be stirring. Conrad saw Rady's expression and smiled faintly. He turned around and threw the dagger to the dark priest. It was a dagger used for sacrifices and it couldn't be used to kill people. As a member of the Tree Shepherds, he was well aware of this. The ritual was a sacred activity and part of the plan to welcome the Dark Dragon's return. The Dark Bishop glanced at the red-haired girl and quickly caught up with her. He bowed his head respectfully and praised in a gloomy voice, "You really are a master at playing with people's hearts." In fact, only he knew that this demon-like youth did not ask the mercenaries any questions from the start. Everything was a show for Rady to see. From the start, Conrad knew that the youth was weak. Human nature is weak. It is the nature of animals to seek benefits and avoid harm. "I've never toyed with anyone, I just give them more choices," the leader of the paper cards replied. Compared to those who talk about honor and justice, I have a weakness, and that is that I never lie." The dark priest laughed softly, "But humans are cunning. They won't show their weak side. That's why interrogations are an art." Conrad smiled. "Actually, I was interested in his identity. I planted a chess piece in the kingdom of steady skies. Who knows when it will come in handy. But why did you agree to lend him your new pet?" "That girl's will hasn't disappeared yet. Let her see how bad her former companions can be. Only by seeing the dark side of human nature can she accept the information provided by the blood of God," the dark priest replied. "Good plan. What do you think, leader? Let's make some preparations and head to Hugel's place first." They actually headed northeast. They knew that the northeast was the lizardman's territory, so they thought in reverse and went in the opposite direction. If not for the fact that he can control people's hearts, he would have fooled me as well. To be honest, the dark priest shook his head, "I don't like dealing with that stinky lizard man." "I don't like it either." Conrad took off his blood-stained gloves and replied. The stars from the night before seemed to indicate the clear skies. Apart from the people involved, no one else knew about the cruel massacre in the forest. The only trace left behind was the faint black smoke behind Brando's group. The scorching sun was still shining on the forest in this area. After absorbing enough sunlight, the layers of treetops showed a breathtaking emerald green color, the green of life. Although this was a non-existent possibility, the mercenaries who had experienced the massacre last night could not help but suspect that the trees were so lush after absorbing the nutrients from the fresh blood. They whispered to each other, but their low voices did not escape the young man's sharp senses. "Feudal superstitions are really scary," Brando muttered as he looked at the black card in his hand. It was obviously made of silver, but it had a strange ink-black color. Melissa's smile was so warm, but it was a stark contrast. This was his only black card, but where would he find a card that could provide him with the dark element? If he could summon that girl as soon as possible, he would be able to do whatever he wanted for a long time. But as of now, this was still a matter that had no clue. He looked at the card in a daze and suddenly stopped what he was doing. Once again, he was sure that the throbbing in his heart last night was the card's resonance. According to the rules of the Planeswalker, this meant that there was another card from the same set of cards in his hand in this area, and there was a bridge between the cards. If he was not a Planeswalker last night, then the reaction would not be a card resonance, but a magic resonance reaction like the last time in the Golden Tree Canyon. But after he searched through all his cards, he found that the card that resonated with him was actually this card of fate. The Unicorn Knight that represented Medisha. The Eversong card set was created for him, but even Brando did not expect that a new rule would be added to the set in such a short time. It could be a new card of fate, or it could be an existence that resonated with Medisha's attributes. Whether it was an equipment, a creature, or a barrier, it meant that this thing had the potential to be sealed into the set. But it could not be a land card because Brando already knew that except for a few special cases, land cards would not resonate with any other cards. This resonance had happened 6 times since last night, and each time was closer than the last. The last time was more than an hour ago and it was almost to their left. This discovery made Brando a little confused. Could it really be some kind of creature? Or could it be that someone was moving with that card? He looked up at the sun. After a night of trekking, it was already close to noon. After Iron rank and above or Constitution had reached 3 energy ranks, 1 or 2 nights of not sleeping would not have any effect. It was just that Roman and Amandina were a little more strained. Brando withdrew his gaze and looked at the situation of the 2 ladies. Fortunately, the wild elves were taking care of them and they could barely keep up with the group. There was not much time. Because of the delay at the Altar of Order, they had to seize every minute and every second. To be continued. If you want to know the future, please go to www.chidian.com. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 168. Indeed, they did not have much time left. But that was only relative. The disciples of the Black Flames were active in the forest, which meant that they would be in danger at any time. But on the other hand, he knew that the disciples of the Black Flames were still looking for trouble with Buga and Makarov, and the only thing they had to face was the Lizardmen's lair, which was defenseless. Although a battle was unavoidable, he knew that the Lizardmen were just a bunch of tree herders' pawns. It was written clearly in the guide that the whole situation was a trap. Some of the officials in Chablis had been bribed by the tree herders and were waiting for Makarov to jump into the trap. Of course, the Sly Fox's reputation was not in vain. Even in such a situation, he still managed to send Duke Lone's only son out safely. But he was going to be in big trouble this time. But all of this had nothing to do with Brando. The guide mentioned that the disciples of the Black Flames did not join forces with the Lizardmen because the storyline had already ended. In other words, their only opponents were the Lizardmen that had yet to fully evolve. He only needed to look at the 20 elven heavy infantrymen behind him. Their bodies were covered in shining silver armor, and their faces were covered in winged silver helmets. Only a pair of pale silver eyes could be seen, and he felt incomparably confident. They were the Elven Guards, the Phoenix Guards. They were the backbone of the Sacred Alliance's land forces. Although the commander of the Elven Guards with a golden helmet had told him that their strength was rapidly depleting when they left the altar, Brando was not worried. The Lizardman's nest was only 2 days away from the altar, which was less than half of the Elven Guards' strength. Moreover, even if their strength was reduced by half, the Elven Guards were not weaker than level 30 elites. They could easily wipe out the Lizardmen. The only thing he was worried about was the disciples of the Black Flames. They were currently playing hide-and-seek with Buga. When they came back to their senses, Brando thought that he had already gotten the Philosopher's Slate and Medish's necklace and escaped far away. He could consider leaving behind a pile of Lizardmen's corpses. Treasures, quest items, experience, none of them could be missing. This was especially true for hardcore players. Brando was even considering if he should properly devise a plan to use the resources he had on hand to kill the level 50 boss Oracle. Using a high-level NPC to kill a boss was the most exciting thing in the game. As for the leader of the Paper Cards mercenaries, Conrad, he would just be a side dish to the main course. Of course, in addition to these fantasies, Brando still had a headache. Most of the Silver Elves were silent and arrogant, and they followed behind the group from a distance. In fact, they only needed to make sure that no one could bypass them and attack Brendel from this distance, and that was enough. Although the humans were their allies, the Silver Elves thought highly of themselves and were unwilling to walk together with human mercenaries. This was a reasonable thing. Of course, this reasonable was only what they thought. Brando's mercenaries of Lopez were already filled with resentment. When had they ever been looked down upon like this? The Nightsong Tiger looked back at the Silver Elves and frowned. He knew how terrifying these people were, so he did not say much. He only said, "My lord, the Unicorn Knight is the core card of the Eversong card deck. Only one of the secondary cards in the deck can resonate with the core card." Yes, Brando interrupted the Nightsong Tiger in his mind. "You've said it 6 times already. If the main card is of silver quality, then the secondary cards must also be of silver quality, right? I can even recite it. Of course I'm concerned about this, but you also noticed that the card is getting closer and closer to us. I think there's something strange going on here. Why don't we wait for the enemy to arrive?" The Nightsong Tiger smiled. How could he not know this? But his lord always seemed to be indifferent to these important matters. After all, the stronger the planeswalker, the stronger the summoned creatures would be, but Brando did not seem to listen to him. The Nightsong Tiger had repeatedly hinted that Brando should focus on the planeswalker's cultivation and card collection, but Brando still did not change his mind. Even though the Nightsong Tiger was experienced and knowledgeable, he still did not know what Brando's goal was. Could it be that he only wanted to become a king? In his opinion, this was meaningless, especially after coming into contact with the world of planeswalkers. Mortals were mortals after all, and the ultimate goal of a planeswalker was to explore the true meaning of this world and find a way to become a higher existence. Compared to this, was there really anything in the mortal world that was attractive to him? The Nightsong Tiger could not help but rub his unshaven chin. He could not understand Brando's thoughts. However, he did not expect that Brando's thoughts were even more easy to understand than he thought. This was because he was drooling over a pile of non-existent loot. The attractiveness of a boss to a player would always be there, especially when you knew that you had a chance to kill it and get equipment. However, just as the Nightsong Tiger was immersed in his thoughts, he suddenly felt a tap on his back. This was no small matter. Brando turned around and saw a shiny golden helmet and a pair of silver-gray eyes. It was the Elven commander. Brendel recognized him at a glance and could not help but curse in his heart. "Brother, you don't make any noise when you walk." He patted his chest and let out a sigh of relief, then asked, "What's wrong?" However, the Elven commander was a little wronged. Although the Phoenix Guards were known as the strongest heavy infantry in the continent, that was 7 centuries ago. But their strength lay in their combat skills and equipment, not in their stealth techniques. The reason why he was startled was purely because he had been distracted for too long. The Elven commander did not feel guilty for scaring the leader of the group. Of course, if the Elven commander took off his helmet, he would be so handsome that Brando would die of jealousy. However, the Elven commander's face was expressionless. He coldly gestured and whispered, "There's a group of people escaping towards our direction." Escape? Brando was stunned for a moment before he noticed the Elven commander's choice of words. Who would be escaping in this direction at this time? Logically speaking, Buga's group should be in the south. This was written clearly in the walkthrough, and he believed it without a doubt. Ever since he came to this world, history had never deviated from it. The Elven commander glanced at him with his silver-gray eyes, as if he was dissatisfied with Brendel's question, but he still nodded. Brando knew that the Elven commander would not joke with him. In fact, he had always doubted whether the Elven commander would joke with him. Or perhaps the word joke did not exist in their dictionary. But that was not important. He immediately raised his hand and signaled for the others to stop. Brando had already established his authority in this group, except for the Elven commander. Once he raised his hand, the mercenaries immediately stopped. Amandina and the Roman who were originally sleepy suddenly woke up. Romaine raised her head and asked curiously, "What's wrong, Brando?" Brando gestured for her to be quiet. Soon he heard the rustling of footsteps through the bushes. The footsteps were messy, as if they were in a panic and did not know where to go. It was obvious that a group of people was escaping. Brando looked at the Elven commander beside him and could not help but admire him. As expected of a high-level NPC, his alertness is not something a normal player can compare to. He had seen many players go out adventuring as if they were on a spring outing. It was simply unbearable to look at. Of course, the players were strong, and sometimes even if they were ambushed, the result would be written in the opposite direction. He tilted his head and listened carefully. Sure enough, he heard another sound from further away. It was the pursuers, and they had mounts. Brando's expression immediately became serious. There were only 2 forces that could use mounts in this area. One was the lizard men and their traditional dragon hunters, and the other was the disciples of the Black Flames and their demons. It was difficult for a warhorse to display its advantage in the forest, especially in a hilly forest like this. Brando had never seen anyone who was so reckless as to ride a warhorse in a hilly forest. He immediately ordered everyone to spread out and prepare for battle. But in the next moment, the panicked escapees entered his field of vision. There were 6 people in a row, half male and half female. They were all dressed in ragged clothes like refugees. Their bodies were covered with various wounds, but at least they did not lose their weapons. Not losing their weapons meant that they did not lose their fighting spirit. Under these conditions, it was enough to show that they were extremely outstanding mercenaries. Because of this, Brando had already recognized them from their attire. They were mercenaries from the Grey Wolves mercenaries. No, these people were not just mercenaries from the Grey Wolves mercenaries. Brando narrowed his eyes. These people were the Judlon mercenaries, a rare group of heavy infantry in the Grey Wolves mercenaries. He had seen them before. But he immediately frowned. Something was not right. According to the strategy, the disciples of the Black Flames and the Grey Wolves mercenaries should not appear in this direction. He thought for a moment and thought that they might be mercenaries that got separated from Buga's group. Even though the possibility of them getting separated was small, but compared to the other possibility, Brando was more willing to believe that was the reason. When the mercenaries saw Brando's group, they were obviously shocked. Their faces were filled with despair. But in the next moment, one of them recognized Brando. In fact, Brando also recognized him. He was the young man who spoke a few words with Rady that afternoon. Of course, compared to the hot-tempered white-haired kid, he had a much better impression of this young man. He remembered what the other party's name was. "All right, Sanford. Mr. Brando, please help us." When Sanford saw Brendel, it was as if he saw his savior. His entire body seemed to have been sucked out of him, and he knelt down and shouted anxiously as he raised his head. Even though Brendel did not like to meddle in other people's business, he was not someone who would not help others when they were in danger. Furthermore, he had the support of the Phoenix Guards, and it was the best time for him to take advantage of the situation. He knew that the Grey Wolves mercenaries were gone, and even though Makarov had treated them as cannon fodder, it did not change the fact that most of them were experienced warriors. They were mercenaries and there was no other path for them to take. If that was the case, he could buy them over. The Judlon mercenaries were one of the best mercenaries. Brendel nodded and ordered his mercenaries to protect these people. At the same time, he asked the question that he was most concerned about at the moment: "What's the matter? Why are you here?" But before Sanford could answer, his pursuers had already answered for him. Rustling sounds could be heard from the forest not far away. The leaves rustled and a few knights riding on wild boars rushed out from behind. Of course, those were not wild boars. Other than the wood elves, Brando was probably the only one who could recognize what the disciples of the Black Flames were riding. They were lesser demons, a type of demon that looked like a wild boar but had brown and green spots all over their bodies. They had 4 pairs of fangs and 4 pairs of eyes. Lesser demons were one of the most important components of the demon cavalry. Being the mounts of the disciples of the Black Flames was a good choice. However, Brando took a deep breath when he saw the disciples of the Black Flames attire. "Mr. Brando, be careful. They are a little strange." Sanford whispered a warning. "Nonsense, of course they are strange." Brendel could not help but curse in his mind. How could it not be strange that these disciples of the Black Flame sect were all high-ranked disciples? These were the elite cavalry of the disciples of the Black Flames. Why would they chase after these 5 mercenaries who looked like beggars? No, wait. He suddenly pulled out his sword. Brando realized a problem. If the disciples of the Black Flames had really chased after them, Sanford and the others wouldn't have had the chance to get here. In other words, they were purposely chased here. But what is the meaning of this? Is this a show of force? He stared at the disciples of the Black Flames in front of him. He didn't dare to confirm whether these annoying bastards had their eyes on him or not, even though they didn't seem to have any interactions with each other. But at this time, the elven commander suddenly said, "There are still people in the forest." Brando immediately looked in that direction. He couldn't see anyone in the forest. He could only see layers upon layers of leaves, forming a mottled color in the forest. But in the next moment he suddenly felt something in his heart. The Unicorn Knight's card seemed to have a life of its own in his hand as it pulsed once. Damn, it's the card's reaction again. So that's what happened. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 169. Judging from the distance of each response, the disciples of the Black Flame sect were indeed here to cause trouble for him. Brando shook his head and thought to himself, "I was just about to look for you guys, but you guys came knocking on my door." This kind of selfless service, dedicated to the benefit of others, and willing to travel thousands of miles just to deliver equipment and EXP, was worthy of praise. So that's what's going on. Even though there was only silence, Brando could already feel the presence of the person on the other side of the forest. He could not help but slap his forehead with a helpless look. "Come out." Brando waved his hand in the direction of the forest. The forest was silent. The mercenaries were stunned and turned to look at him and the Silver Elf commander behind him. The young man was slightly startled and said, "Ha! Not coming out?" He sneered and pointed his right index finger forward. OSS. Brando had never been a patient person. Since the other party insisted on playing hide and seek with him, he did not mind using violence to chase this ignorant fool out. The direction of the flow of the air became chaotic in an instant, as if the air was filled with countless turbulent vectors towards a single point. The air swirled and compressed and then exploded as a massive amount of energy surged forward. With Brando as the center, the trees on both sides of the forest fell and snapped one after another. After a loud bang, the energy of the wind bullet had cleared out a radial area in the forest. As the dust settled, a red-haired girl was revealed. The strong airflow had already torn the cloak draped over her body, revealing the red and black armor underneath. The girl was wearing a one-piece battle dress, with the skirt armor hanging just above her knees. Below it was a steel shin armor with long boots, red and black. It formed an absolute domain just right. She was in a combat stance, holding her halberd in front of her, as if she was able to stop the wind bullet from moving forward. From the obvious traces on the ground, the shockwave created by the airflow separated behind the red-haired girl, forming 2 trails that extended for more than 10 meters before gradually disappearing. Strong. That was the only thought in everyone's mind. The Ring of the Wind Empress had the destructive power of a peak black iron, and its impact was even stronger. If one wanted to block this attack head-on, they would need to have the strength of a lower silver. However, to be completely unscathed and not even move his body, gold rank. The mercenaries present couldn't help but groan from the bottom of their hearts. The Nightsong Tiger rubbed his temples and wondered what was going on. Had they arrived at the age of chaos? Over the past few days, gold-ranked forces had appeared one after another, and all of them were so young. It would be understandable if this place was near the capital or a large city, but this was Erwin's Ranner region, the southernmost mountainous region. What is wrong with this world? After a moment of silence, the red-haired girl flicked her ponytail and looked up. A pair of golden red eyes stared unblinkingly at Brando. It was as if flames were burning within them, and they were filled with the will to fight. She straightened her body and swung her halberd backward. A flash of lightning flashed past, and the trees in the same direction immediately fell down with a ka-ka-ka sound. The girl smiled, revealing her white canine teeth. "Is that all you've got?" It was her. Brando sighed. How could he have forgotten about the existence of this boss in this forest? The Angel of Lightning, the Crimson Spirit Knight, Milphite. Brando looked at the girl who held the strange halberd with one hand and instantly recognized her identity. He couldn't help but feel a little annoyed. How could he have forgotten about this? The spear of lightning that countless mercenaries scrambled for back then. But perhaps he didn't expect that this Lady Knight had already taken over this place so early in the era when she was the king of this place. In fact, he had already guessed the answer, but before the answer was revealed, he didn't dare to be certain that he was right. The law of Evernight was immortality. The heart towards the light but fell into the darkness. It was like a lament lingering in the air. The two spirit knights who were born in the same area resonated with each other from the very beginning. Brando couldn't help but flip open the card in his hand and look at it. He thought to himself, Lady Martha, I named Evernight in the hopes that this set would be as invincible as the Silver Elves' Evernight Legion, and not this. But when he looked up, he was keenly aware that the red-haired girl didn't seem to be in the form of a spirit. But she was no different from Milphite. Regardless of the way she attacked or her appearance, they were all so similar. But Milphite was clearly an incomplete angel in history, and he was in the form of a spirit. But the red-haired girl in front of him was not in the form of a spirit, and from her aura, he could feel that she had received the complete blood of God. But what was going on? Scarlet? Rady? Suddenly, a voice called out from beside him. Brando turned around and saw that the one who called out was Sanford, the young man who was dragged back by the mercenaries of Lopez. He followed Sanford's gaze and saw that not far behind the red-haired girl, there was a white-haired young man cowering behind a bush. It was the young man who always acted arrogant in front of him. Rady? Damn, it's that pretentious prick again. Brando cursed in his heart. He thought that after teaching this guy a lesson last night, he would at least restrain himself a little. He didn't think that he would come again today. Wait, why is this guy with the disciples of the Black Flames? Brando narrowed his eyes and saw that there was indeed a low-grade demon beside the white-haired youth. Ah, so that's how it is. He couldn't help but sneer. You just joined your new master and you can't wait to kill your former companions. You really are dutiful. Everyone was stunned. Rady, why you joined them? Sanford and the other Grey Wolves mercenaries didn't know how to react. They turned around and looked at Rady, unable to believe their ears. However, these people were not idiots after all. Thinking back to everything that had happened before, they understood everything. The more hot-tempered one's eyes turned red as they cursed. You traitor, to think that I treated you as a brother. Rady, you disappoint us. Sanford was stunned for a moment before he asked, Rady, what's going on? If looks could kill, Rady would have cut Brando into pieces a few times already. At that moment he even had the thought of swallowing Rady whole. He originally wanted to hide behind the scenes and let the disciples of the Black Flames kill his brothers or companions, who knew him. That way no one would question him and he wouldn't have to worry about his conscience. Of course, that was if he still had a conscience. But he did not expect that his wishful thinking would be completely destroyed by Brendel's wind bullet before it could even take effect. He couldn't help but curse in his heart. He cursed Brando and the pointy-eared elf behind him for discovering him. Wait, pointy-eared elves? He was stunned for a moment. He saw the 20 or so fully armored elves behind Brando. How did they appear? Could it be that the leader? No, that cunning-maned wolf, had other arrangements here? Rady looked around cautiously, afraid that it was a trap. But he quickly calmed down. With Scarlet here, he didn't need to be afraid of any ambush. The current Scarlet, or rather the God of Lightning's emissary Millfight, was a gold-ranked warrior. A mere 30 silver-ranked guards wouldn't be able to withstand a single blow. After he calmed down, he straightened his back and looked at the elven warriors with disdain. Elven heavy infantry, these fellows sure are creative. Don't they know that the most suitable classes for the weak and agile elves are rangers, archers or hunters? He laughed coldly in his heart, but when he noticed the hateful and doubtful gazes of his former companions, he realized that he had to explain himself. How could he be called a traitor? Rady couldn't help but be glad that he had a backup plan. That was also the reason why he brought these people here. One reason was to let Brando and the rest take care of these weak elves, and the other reason was to find an excuse if he was exposed. He played with the ring on his finger and smiled hypocritically. No, everyone. I didn't join Commander Conrad. I only made an agreement with him to borrow his strength to deal with this fellow. He raised his finger and pointed at Brando. This fellow who caused all this trouble. Meh. Brando pointed at himself and couldn't help but laugh. That's right, it's you. Rady looked at Brando, new and old grudges surging in his heart. His eyes reddened. If it wasn't for you, I wouldn't have ended up like this. That old bastard Makarov would rather use us as cannon fodder to distract the disciples of the Black Flame so that you could leave safely. It's just that he probably didn't expect things to end up like this, right? He couldn't help but laugh sinisterly. Mr. Brando, 12 silver-ranked bodyguards, that's really amazing. I'm really scared. But what are you going to do this time? Do you still have the confidence to show off in front of my people? Where's the courage you had when you taught me a lesson last night? Fortunately, Brando wasn't angered to death by this narcissistic fellow. Just as he was about to open his mouth, he didn't expect the white-haired young man to wave his hand and interrupt him. Don't quibble, Commander Conrad has already told me everything. Otherwise, why would they assign me so many elites just to chase after you? I'm not an idiot, so you're the real Echo, right? What? Amik? Brando was almost petrified. Right, your sister. P.S. Students, don't let your enthusiasm drop. I'm still burning with passion equals. Smiley face. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com to read more chapters. Support the author. Support the original reading. Chapter 170. Amik? Fuck, I'm your grandfather. Brendel reacted and immediately cursed in his heart. However, he quickly understood the situation and couldn't help but curse Makarov for using him as a pawn. He took a deep breath and made a mental note to settle the score with Makarov. He would go to Lantern Island and settle the score with him when he had the time. After all, it was better to deal with this arrogant bastard first. He felt that if he spoke another word with Makarov, he would lose 10 years of his life. But before he could say anything, Sanford interrupted. Reedy, did you really join Conrad's side? Brando turned around and saw the young man calmly looking at the arrogant bastard's eyes. There was no expression on his face other than a little disappointment. Brando was stunned. He didn't expect the young man to have such a side to him. The white-haired young man was stunned. He looked at the people in front of him, or rather, his former companions. He then looked at Sanford's gaze. He couldn't help but shrink back. But when he looked at the others, they were all looking at him with anger. Reedy coldly snorted. It's that simple. Makarov has already given up on us. Can't you see? That old bastard is only using you as pawns. Why should I work for him? If that's the case, why can't I choose a better way to live? So you came to kill us to show your loyalty to your new master? Sanford asked coldly. I'm your best friend, Reedy. These people were once your companions. Makarov let you down and we let you down as well? Reedy choked. He gritted his teeth and replied with difficulty, I didn't want to kill you in the first place. If you were with me, I would still treat you as my companions. The white-haired young man hesitated for a moment before replying with a guilty conscience. I don't need your charity. Sanford spat in disgust. I must have been blind to treat you as my best friend. Still. The ragged men and women of the Grey Wolves mercenaries replied indignantly in unison. Brando was originally calmly watching the scene of Sanford being betrayed, but he didn't expect Sanford to turn around and bow respectfully. Mr. Brando, Reedy is right. Makarov might have abandoned us this time, but our commander has treated us like family for the past 10 years. If there was any resentment, it would vanish at this moment. From this moment on, we are just a group of pitiful worms that no one will take in. Mr. Brando, only you are willing to save us. If you are willing, we hope to join your team. We don't have any requests. We just want to survive. That's all. Brando paused for a moment and looked at the others. Most of the refugees, of the Grey Wolves mercenaries, seemed to have accepted Sanford's suggestion. It could be seen that this young man was quite influential in this group. But he lowered his head and looked at Reedy with a smile that didn't look like a smile. That's true, but did you forget? This fellow said that I have a close relationship with that Makarov you speak of. Even if that's the case, you can still accept it? That fellow was blinded by hatred. He's no different from an idiot. How can we believe his bullshit? One of the mercenaries couldn't help but snort. Brando looked at Sanford and saw him nodding. He couldn't help but laugh in his heart. It seems like this white-haired fellow isn't all bad. At least he sent a group of experienced mercenaries to me. However, Brando maintained a straight face and replied solemnly, "We'll talk about this later. It seems that I still have some personal grudges with Reedy. It won't be too late to talk about it after I've dealt with this matter." Brando finished and raised his head. It would have been better if he didn't, but the moment he did, he almost died from anger. Reedy actually opened his mouth wide and laughed exaggeratedly. Ah! The white-haired youth looked at them with disdain and laughed. "You want to deal with me?" Brando, "No, Mr. Eek. Perhaps you still don't understand the situation. These disciples of the Black Flame sect are the elites of the Black Flame sect. Every one of them has the strength of a peak silver. Of course, Miss Scarlet is also one of my warriors. Don't tell me you don't know what's good for you? She is a warrior with the strength of a gold-tier warrior. How dare you be so arrogant to say that you want to deal with me? Haha, with just 30 low silver-tier bodyguards? That's not a funny joke." As he spoke, he walked behind Scarlet and reached out his hand to pat the red-haired girl's face. However, she brushed his hand away without giving him any face. Scarlet turned around and looked at him coldly. Reedy coughed awkwardly. Fortunately, his former companions didn't mind his awkwardness. Sanford and the rest of the Grey Wolves mercenaries were all stunned by his words. They knew that this guy had no reason to lie, but they didn't think that this lunatic would be so crazy as to lay his hands on the person he liked. Of course, they wronged their white-haired classmate. After all, Scarlet's transformation was done by the Dark Bishop. Even if he wanted to, he didn't have the ability to do so. But on the other hand, they didn't expect the disciples of the Black Flame sect to be all silver-ranked fighters. There was even a gold-ranked fighter eyeing them covetously. Even though the gold-ranked fighter used to be their companion, the red-haired girl didn't seem to recognize them. The Grey Wolves mercenaries couldn't help but take a step back. Are we really going to die here today? They subconsciously looked at their new boss, but what they saw stunned them. The young businessman was still in the mood to comfort his female companion at a time like this. "It's fine. Don't mind that egomaniac." Brendel turned around and patted Romaine's cheeks. He used a reassuring tone and said, "Don't worry about it. I don't care about him. What are you doing? Don't touch a girl's face." Romaine raised her eyebrows and quickly blocked his hand with a red face, not allowing him to take advantage of her any further. She defended herself loudly at the same time. The mercenaries of Lopez were already used to it. They didn't like the egomaniac for a long time. They looked at Brendel, then at the 20 or so silver elves behind him who were standing still like wooden blocks. They knew who was going to be the unlucky one. Their lord looked righteous on the surface, but he was full of evil tricks. How could he be so easily taken advantage of? But the Grey Wolves mercenaries who didn't know what was going on were petrified. They screamed in their hearts, Hey sir, do you understand the situation? We are facing a group of silver-ranked fighters and a gold-ranked fighter." But Brando's indifference had the desired effect. Rady's body trembled with anger. He was not usually so arrogant, but the humiliation that Brendel and Conrad gave him last night had finally exploded. He couldn't help but bark like a mad dog, "Go and kill them. No, leave that young man alive. I want to let him know the consequences of offending me." After he shouted, he finally calmed down, "And those two women, leave them alive." After he gave the order, he couldn't help but lick his lips. But Brendel turned around at this moment and raised his hand. Wait. Rady was stunned. He had already given the order. Wasn't it a little too late to beg for mercy? He looked at the disciples of the Black Flames mercenaries who rushed forward as if the person in front of them wasn't their enemy, but their father's murderer. There was no room for them to stop. The white-haired youth was stunned for a moment. He thought that this was good. He wanted to see if the other party knew the meaning of fear. "I'll let you pretend." He cursed in his heart. The Grey Wolves mercenaries' faces darkened. Their hands and feet turned cold. But even so, these soldiers still picked up their weapons in fear and trepidation. preparing for the last fight. At worst they would die. They were the Grey Wolves mercenaries. Even if they had only used this name before, they could not go back on their promise and let this name be covered in dust. Rady widened his eyes as if he wanted to see the end of these people who went against him. But he immediately saw that when Brando raised his hand, he only said one sentence with a smile. It wasn't begging for mercy. Rady took a long time to react. The meaning of that sentence was, "Unfortunately, you're too early." "I'm too early?" The white-haired youth was stunned. What does that mean? Did he lose his mind from the shock? However, Rady quickly changed his mind. He saw the young man raise his hand and wave it down. Following that, more than 20 expressionless elven infantrymen in heavy armor moved. Rady's expression changed when he saw them move. He was indeed too early. If he was late by a day or two, even if he couldn't do anything to Brando, at least he wouldn't have lost his life here. But there was no medicine for regret in this world. When Rady's expression changed, the Grey Wolves mercenaries, the mercenaries of Lopez, and even Amandina's expression changed at the same time. Because everyone could see that the 20 or so Silver Elf Imperial Guards were suddenly emitting colorful lights. Some were bright, some were dim, and those were like rainbows. They wrapped around their armors and weapons, and they could only mean one thing: elemental power. The strongest heavy infantry in the continent, the Knight of the Holy Cathedral. What elves were only suited to be hunters, rangers, and archers? Rady felt that the words he said before were like slaps to his face. The disciples of the Black Flames mercenaries didn't even have time to wake up from their frenzied state before they were drowned in the rainbow light. Swords flashed, and human heads and demon heads flew high into the sky. 20 rainbows, unstoppable. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com to read more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 171. Perhaps it should be said this way. The battle had ended before it even began. The silver disciples of the Black Flames were as weak as newborn chickens in front of the elven heavy infantry of the Phoenix Guards who had mastered elemental power. The Silver Elves had a long lifespan and were a proud race that highly valued combat techniques. Their heavy infantry didn't just have outstanding physical attributes and excellent equipment. When you were faced with a warrior who had been constantly improving their combat techniques for hundreds of years, you could imagine how helpless you would be. A single glance or a single movement was enough to betray one's intentions in the eyes of the elite Silver Elves. Brando couldn't help but laugh when he saw the disciples of the Black Flames trying to show off their pitiful combat skills in front of the elven warriors. Even with his experience, he didn't dare to be rash in front of these true combat machines. To the Silver Elves, combat was an art and the pursuit of beauty. Vulgar, so vulgar. The Silver Elves couldn't believe that after hundreds of years, the servants of darkness would use such crude combat skills to fight against them. 7 centuries ago, the Dark Dragon, the Myernas, and the other servants were the strongest enemies of all intelligent beings. They had the most advanced civilization, the most advanced magic, and the most amazing combat skills. They had never been hostile to civilization because the cruel and dark rule represented the most advanced civilization in the world. The combat skills of the servants of darkness were so fascinating that many of their brethren joined the darkness. Who would have thought that after just a few hundred years, they would have regressed to this extent? No, this wasn't even combat skills anymore. It was simply unbearable. The disciples of the Black Flames obviously didn't expect that their final resistance would provoke the anger of the Silver Elves. In fact, it wasn't just them. Perhaps other than Brando, everyone present was ashamed of the Silver Elves' opinion. That's right. After the War of the Holy Saints, civilization didn't improve. Instead, it was regressing. The supreme power that both sides of the war possessed had long become a legend. But no matter what the others thought, the dust had already settled before the battle truly began. In the blink of an eye, the disciples of the Blackfire sect had turned into cold corpses on the ground. Black blood flowed out from the headless and cold bodies and spread along the uneven ground in the forest like a network of black blood vessels. The white-haired young man seemed to have been nailed to the ground by an invisible force. His mouth was wide open and he couldn't utter a single word. After a long while, a crisp sound was heard. Everyone subconsciously turned their heads and saw that it was the big man from the Grey Wolves mercenaries. His great sword had fallen to the ground with a clang, but he didn't seem to realize it. He was looking at the elven royal guards who had stopped and regrouped with a shocked expression. The Grey Wolves mercenaries couldn't help but look at Brando in shock. What kind of person could have 20 holy knights as guards? Could it be that this young man was actually a prince of Kurlutz and was just passing by? Although this speculation was a little ridiculous, it seemed that the former was more acceptable than the fact that 20 living paladins appeared in front of him. But just as everyone was in a daze, the red-haired girl put down her spear and stood between the elves and the white-haired young man. Her intention was clear. She didn't want to let these elves kill Reedy. The red-haired girl looked up and pursed her lips. Her expression was solemn. She already knew that she wasn't a match for any of these elven warriors. But even so, the battle intent in her eyes didn't subside. She lowered her center of gravity slightly and leaned forward. She was already in a fighting posture, like a female leopard that was about to go berserk. Scarlet. The girl's action was too familiar. It almost made Sanford and the others think that she was still the Scarlet of the Grey Wolves mercenaries. Scarlet, that bastard is a traitor. Why are you still protecting him? The burly man couldn't help but shout. Only this once? The red-haired girl gritted her teeth, but she shook her head as if she wanted to get rid of the thought. Only this last time. I can't watch him die here. Scarlet? Reedy was stunned. This time he could see the shadow of the Scarlet in the girl's back. Get out of here. The red-haired girl shouted angrily, Go find Lord Conrad. Reedy was stunned for a moment before he came to his senses and scrambled to run away. But Brando's eyes flashed with a trace of surprise when he saw this. With his rich experience, he instantly caught the struggle of the Crimson Knight. It was a rejection reaction. This meant that the girl's consciousness hadn't completely disappeared. What she said before was completely based on her own consciousness. Otherwise, why would a cold and emotionless being like an oracle take the initiative to protect another person? This meant that the oracle was still in her newborn form. When Brando realized this, he suddenly understood why the Crimson Knight turned into a ghost knight. He couldn't help but give her a thumbs up in his mind. She was willing to sacrifice her existence to fight against the invasion of the blood of God. This girl really has character. Thinking of this, he couldn't help but respect her. But respect was one thing. He couldn't let that disgusting narcissist escape. Brando wasn't the kind of person who liked to let a tiger return to the mountains. That bastard was obviously not going to let him off. Who knew if he would turn into an Ultraman and cause trouble for him? Even if he didn't have a protagonist's aura, what if he hurt the Roman or the people around him? Wouldn't it be too late for regrets? He decisively made a hand gesture. His meaning was clear. Knock that girl out and kill that bastard behind her. The elven commander beside Brando was slightly stunned. For the first time he looked at the young lord in surprise. The hand gesture that Brando made was not simple. It was one of the hand gestures that the ancient commanders often used in the War of the Holy Saints. These hand gestures had developed to a considerable extent. In this era, there weren't many people who knew the hand gestures from 7 centuries ago. But being surprised was one thing. The commander's face was cold and he quickly passed down the order in a professional manner. There was no doubt, wanting to escape from the care of 20 holy cathedral knights was obviously a fantasy. Even if there was a gold-ranked existence supporting from the side, the result would still be the same. Balagon, a ruin left behind by the Silver Elves before the glorious year. The Lizardman commander, Hugel, occupied the largest hall in the ruins. This hall was probably used by the Silver Elves for worship and important ceremonies. But like other buildings after being abandoned for centuries, this once majestic hall had become dilapidated. Perhaps it was due to their instincts, or perhaps due to their incomplete evolution, the lizardmen were still unable to break away from their close relatives' habits. Hugel himself still maintained a strong sense of territory. He had long regarded this hall as his personal property and anyone who dared to touch it was tantamount to challenging his authority among the lizardmen bandits. But what made Hugel proud was that he had always admired his own sense of aesthetics. Compared to those smelly fellows, he naturally tidied up the hall like a true civilized person. The center of the hall was laid with a red carpet like it was a few hundred years ago. Around the red carpet were various furniture of different styles that were snatched from who knows where. These furniture were not stacked together in any particular order, but Hugel especially liked this aspect. He was the one who ordered his subordinates to stack these furniture together. This was so that he could admire them daily. When Conrad and the Dark Bishop of the Disciples of the Black Flames opened the door and entered the hall, the three of them snorted coldly. The Dark Bishop did not want to see these two annoying faces, while the Dark Bishop did not want to see the vulgar aesthetics of this undeveloped and simple-minded reptile. At the very least, the mercenary commander could not see the difference between this hall and a garbage dump. Donald, I heard that you died there. Hugel straightened the collar of his trench coat, which he had snatched from a passing noble. His wrinkled face was filled with pity as he said, "What a pity it's fake news. It's only one. Let me remind you one last time, my name is Conrad." The mercenary commander was not in the mood to correct the strange crew's grammar that the lizard man had learned from somewhere. He only reminded the lizard man not to pronounce his name with a retroflex sound. "It's all the same." Hugel looked at the dark bishop behind him and said with a smug expression, "I thought that you wouldn't come." Conrad snorted coldly, "You used the excuse of investigating the tomb of the Silver Elven Kings, but I think you're quite content with being a bandit." He looked around. "The things you stole must be worth a lot of money, right?" The lizard man Hugel's frown deepened as he shook his head. No. Let's get down to business." "Then what did you discover?" "Yes, a little bit. But there's not much progress." Hugel shook his head. "We can't get close to the temple. But this thing can help me." He stretched out his skinny hand and shook a necklace. "Wizard, I need some." Conrad and the dark bishop looked at each other. The lizard man Hugel was using the excuse of investigating the tomb of the Silver Elven Kings to act as the local tyrant. Everyone thought so, but they did not expect him to really be here. But now was not the time to be anxious. The mercenary commander reorganized his speech and said, "That's not a problem, but we have something we need your help with." "I've already helped you once," Hugel said unhappily. He had already attracted the attention of the other adventurers when he sent the message to the Grey Wolves mercenaries. "There are benefits for you," the dark bishop said in a low voice. "What kind of benefits?" "A big fish." Conrad's expression was solemn. "Pah!" A muffled sound rang out. Brando grabbed the youth's white hair and pressed his head into the ground, causing him to cry out in pain. From the information Rady revealed, the truth was obvious. Even though Brando did not want to accept this result, he had to admit that the plot had changed. The other party had already set their sights on him. He should have thought of this earlier. He changed the way he completed the quest and the entire plot was reversed. The previous guide did not mention the betrayal of the Crimson Spirit Knight and Rady, nor did it mention that Conrad would be the first to enter the Balagon ruins. In other words, the other party had completely given up on tracking Buga and Makarov, and focused on searching for him. This was all a facade created by that damn sly fox. Even though Brando was furious, he had to admit that the other party's plan was successful. It caused him a lot of trouble and made him angry. The consequences were severe. Amandina did not say a word after hearing Rady's description. After a long while, she suggested, "Should we retreat temporarily, my lord?" But Brando waved his hand. If they wanted to cause trouble for him, they had to be prepared to pay the price. Well, this plot seems to be the final path to 100% completion. I want to see how powerful these disciples of the Black Flames are. Isn't it just a plot with the highest completion rate? Brando thought to himself. It's not like I haven't experienced it before. I want to see how Lady Martha plans to reward me with this completion rate. But just as he was about to flip out, Sanford carefully approached him and whispered, "My lord, what about Scarlet?" Brando turned around and saw the future spirit knight lying on the ground as if she was asleep. A few elven warriors were guarding her. That was impossible. Not to mention what the new Grey Wolves mercenaries would think. Even he himself would not agree to it. Scarlet had already formed a connection with the Eversong card set. If her fate was irreversible, the best outcome would be the same as Medisha. But because she was a newborn angel, and according to Rady's description, she was sealed by a low-ranked priestess. Perhaps she could be saved. I'm not a madman who wants to seal anyone into a card, but I'm willing to do so if it's possible to save this girl with her personality. Moreover, he might even have a gold-ranked subordinate out of thin air. Therefore, he replied without thinking, "Bring him along. After all, he's your companion. Maybe he can still be saved." "Really?" Sanford exclaimed excitedly. Brando nodded. "I can only give it a try." Sanford quickly nodded. He knew that Scarlet's condition was not normal. "What about this bastard?" Amandina looked at Rady with disgust and asked softly. Sanford seemed to have regained his strength when he heard Amandina's words. He struggled to raise his head, and his face was filled with tears mixed with mud. He shouted with all his might, "You promised that as long as I told you everything you wouldn't kill me. I'm a man of my word." Brando nodded. He clapped his hands and stood up, looking at the silver elf beside him. "Commander, I'll have to trouble you to do it for me." To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.gdn.com to read more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 172. If he wanted to achieve a 100% completion rate, he would need to uproot all the enemies in front of him. The difficulty of this mission was far greater than what Brando had imagined. He originally thought that he only needed to save the Grey Wolves mercenaries, but now it seemed that he was too naive. The Amber Sword's mission system is not easy to fool. Even in this world, it still shows its true colors. Even though that was what he said, Brando still cursed the members of the Torrential Rain mission 100 times in his heart. He counted the number of enemies he would have to face. The Grey Wolves mercenaries mentioned that there were more than 100 Lizardmen bandits, but the mission guide clearly stated that there were more than 1,000 of them, perhaps even more. Then there were the disciples of the Black Flames. Their numbers would not be less than 200, and their strength would be above Iron rank. Lastly, there were the 70 dark mercenaries under Conrad, whose strength was similar to the disciples of the Black Flames. The Paper Cards mercenaries were also the only one with the most accurate numbers. This is good news. Then there was the commander of the Lizard Men, Hugel, who was at the pinnacle of silver rank, and Conrad was undoubtedly at the gold rank. As for the Earth Oracle accompanying the disciples of the Black Flames, Brando did not even want to mention it. However, Brando did not know that there was a Dark Oracle, or else he would have cursed out loud. He thought for a while and turned his head to see that the Silver Elves had already dealt with the white-haired egomaniac. The Grey Wolves mercenaries were treating their wounds with the help of their fellow mercenaries, the mercenaries of Lopez. Perhaps because of their similar backgrounds, the two groups got along very well. "What do you plan to do?" A voice sounded from beside him. Brando looked at the Silver Elf commander who was wearing a golden helmet and froze for a moment. If that human did not lie, the disciples of the Black Flames and the Lizard Men should be converging, and their speed should be about the same as ours. When we arrive, we will not only be facing a motley group of Lizard Men. The Silver Elf commander seemed to be explaining something that had nothing to do with him. "That's basically correct," Brendel replied without thinking, "but I'm guessing that Conrad has already met with the Lizard Men commander, Hugel, because he wants to prevent us from sneaking out from the north." The Silver Elf commander looked at him without saying a word. Although Brando and his subordinates were still incomparably powerful at this time, and it seemed like they could easily flatten the Lizardmen, he knew that this was far from the truth. He had never heard of an SSS-level mission that could be completed by pushing. They should have already sent out their spies. "You thought we would run away?" Brando smiled. "But that's good, I want them to make a mistake." Brando's guess was not wrong. That evening, the Lizardmen Dragon Hunter cavalry spread out from their nest in Balagon. The next morning, the withered shrubs on the hillside rustled as a human hand and a slender elf hand separated them to the left and right. Behind the shrubs, Brendel and the Silver Elf commander calmly observed the movements in the valley. Brendel pondered for a moment before he spoke. "Dragon Hunter cavalry. This is the third group since yesterday." The Silver Elf commander's silver eyes reflected the scenery of the valley below, but there was no change in his expression. The Dragon Hunter cavalry's speed and agility in the forest surpassed any cavalry in this era, but it was still far inferior to the Myrna Shadow Knight. The Dragon Hunter cavalry leaped through the forest, its swift figure occasionally passing through the gaps between the canopy, but it was still a little too slow in the eyes of the Silver Elf Master Warrior. From this distance, it's already twice the patrol range of a bandit's nest. Even if it's under the tree herders, it's still not normal. Brando muttered to himself, "Looks like we've entered the storyline mode." "What?" The Silver Elf commander turned around. "Nothing," the young man realized his slip of the tongue and quickly corrected himself, "I'm just estimating the distance." "That's unnecessary." The Silver Elf commander glanced at him. This was not the first time they had done something like this since last night. Brando quickly nodded, "There's nothing to see, let's follow the original plan." He turned around and shouted, "Sanford." The young man who was originally a Grey Wolves mercenary, but was now Brendel's subordinate, panted as he ran up from below. He looked up at the two people above and asked, "Here, my lord, what's the matter?" Even though he had just joined, Brando had already instructed Amandina to tell them his true identity. Of course, it was not a big deal for adventurers, travelers, or even merchants to use a fake identity, but these mercenaries were still happy that Brando trusted them so much. Compared to being a merchant, a future lord's identity was much more attractive to these mercenaries. Compared to a wandering life, these mercenaries were more willing to become a noble's follower. At least they could settle down. Especially from the description of the mercenaries of Lopez, it was obvious that this young lord was different from the other nobles who were opinionated and cold. Even though they had just learned a lesson from the maned wolf, Makarov, what could they do in this chaotic world? They could only work harder to gain the lord's attention. Pass down the order, get ready to move. Brando looked down at the valley below and replied, "No problem, I'll go now." But halfway through, the young man turned back and asked with a puzzled expression, "My lord, there's something I don't quite understand." Sanford hesitated for a moment, but still mustered up his courage to ask, "I feel that with my lord's current strength, there's no need to go through so much trouble. We just need to kill our way through, and I believe that the lizard men will not be able to stop us. Even if they are in cahoots with the disciples of the Black Flames, it will still be the same. As far as I know, even if it's Erewhon." He did not finish his sentence. Even the royal family of Erewhon wouldn't be able to gather more than 20 temple knights. Although the total number of temple knights in Erewhon was more than 20, it was important to understand that not all of these temple knights were loyal to the nobles. Even if there were some who were loyal to a certain faction, not all of them were loyal to a certain faction. Sanford's words sounded like he was questioning Brando's identity, so he shut his mouth. But Brando still understood what he meant. He smiled and replied, "You might be a little disappointed to hear this because these elven allies are not my subordinates. They are fighting alongside us because they have the same goal as us. Another reason is that they cannot leave the area too far, or their strength will gradually weaken." The young man was stunned. He did not understand what Brando meant by their strength weakening. But he immediately replied loudly, "No, my lord. You misunderstood, we will not be disappointed. Did you forget that when we pledged our loyalty to you yesterday, it was not because of your strength? It was because we wanted to repay you for helping us. So, no matter whether we are Grey Wolves mercenaries or former Grey Wolves mercenaries, we will not go back on our words." But he immediately asked, "But these elven allies are temple knights, right? Even if their strength is weakened, is it really that strong?" When he saw Sanford's expression, he knew that there was a problem with his understanding. Sanford could not be blamed. Indeed, according to normal people's understanding, even if a temple knight's strength was weakened by half, they would still be able to maintain their strength at the peak of the gold rank. 20 gold rank pinnacle warriors were indeed enough to sweep through this region. But things did not go as planned. There was something called the level system in this world. Reducing one's strength by half would only reduce one's level by 1 level, but reducing one's level by half would have a huge impact. Unfortunately, the damned altar system really did reduce their strength in such a way. The elven guards were level 60 normal units at their peak. With half of their strength deducted, they would become level 30 normal units. Not to mention that they were at the pinnacle of the gold tier, even silver tier would have a hard time maintaining their strength. 20 silver rankers could easily wipe out the lizard men, but the problem was that Conrad and the Angel of the Earth would be in big trouble. That was why he had to find a way to break through their strength. But it was difficult to explain, so he simply waved his hand and replied, "Don't worry, go and pass down the order. Trust me, I will bring you victory." The young man was stunned for a moment before he nodded. The elven commander watched Sanford's figure disappear into the forest. He then turned around and looked at Brando with his silver-gray eyes. "Human, I didn't expect you to be so arrogant." "It's confidence." Brando raised his head and corrected him. "Remember, this is not the battlefield of the War of the Holy Saints. It is also not the era where all the talented commanders overshadowed all conventional tactics. Of course, perhaps in the near future, this continent will usher in that era again, but not now." He raised his head and looked at the forest in the north. "Now, in this place, I believe that no one has the ability to take victory away from me. I'm telling you this as a veteran commander. Commander, you can record it down." The elven commander looked at him and lowered his head to take off his golden helmet. When he raised his head again, he revealed a handsome and indifferent face. "To be honest, I don't understand." The other party replied as such. "You said that, perhaps in the near future, this continent will usher in that era again." The silver elf turned his face to the side. His cold profile was so beautiful that it would make any woman jealous. He asked, "You mean that the dark dragon will return to this continent?" "No, that's another matter." "Are you so sure, human? Can you see the future?" It was another cold question. Brando was stunned. How could this guy be so good at finding loopholes? The game development team might as well hire him to catch bugs. But he hesitated and said, "It's not foresight, it's a premonition. If you don't believe me, when the time comes, I will return to this place and tell you what happened in the outside world. He didn't know why he said this, but perhaps some secrets had been kept in his heart for too long. This guy is just a ghost that can't leave this place, he thought. The elven commander paused for a moment, then smiled coldly. Nalathar. Brando. Brando, then I'll wait to see your so-called victory. This bastard, he still doesn't believe me. As you wish. Brando gritted his teeth and replied. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 173. From Aekin's point of view, the silence in the valley was strange. In fact, he did not like the silence because danger always lurked in the calm. It was like a venomous snake hiding in the dark, ready to jump out and bite you. Aekin was a lizardmen dragoon hunting squad leader. Usually the orders he received were straightforward and simple: attack or plunder, but dragoon hunting squads would occasionally act as scouts, which was one of the most annoying tasks for the lizardmen. Being a scout was too dangerous, especially in the forest. Professional skills were often more important than speed and agility. Aekin also did not like being unable to display his advantages. He raised his head, his long and narrow eyes reflecting the white-gold rays of the morning sun. The warmth of the sun dispelled the last trace of coldness from the night before. When the warmth seeped into the lizardman's cold blood, he could not help but shiver. The lizardman lieutenant shook its head in disgust. It used the unique nose structure of the lizardmen to track the unusual smell in the air. The order asked them to search for traces of a group of humans, but where were they? To the north of Chablis was a vast and boundless forest. To be honest, Aekin felt that finding a few people in the forest was a bit of a fantasy. But the lizardman lieutenant still carefully held onto his spear. His right hand pointed forward, with only 3 fingers pointing towards the forest in front of him. He made a series of high-pitched sounds, ordering his men to spread out and enter the forest. However, it didn't realize that it had made a mistake at this time. When Aekin sent his men into the strange forest and disappeared without a trace, he realized what was going on. But it was too late to react. The lizard man hurriedly retreated while trying to come up with an excuse to explain to Hugel, the leader of the lizard men, that his carelessness had cost the lives of 4 precious dragon hunters. This question was not easy to answer. Hugel was a vulgar and unsociable nouveau riche in the eyes of most of his men, but he was also a shrewd lizard man. Aekin knew that his leader was not easy to fool. How should he answer? However, it soon realized that it did not need to worry about this problem. When he turned around, he saw a human and an elf standing behind him. He had no idea when they appeared, but he knew that the elf was staring at him coldly. No, it should be a silver elf. Recently, they often went to the graveyard of the silver elf kings to cause trouble, so Aekin had learned something. That silver elf was emitting the aura of a peak gold rank expert. The outcome of the battle was predictable. It was hard to imagine how the 5 weak lizardmen riders would be able to put up any resistance in front of more than 20 gold pinnacle warriors. Therefore Aekin had no choice but to surrender. Sometimes a small mistake could cost a person his life. However, the only thing that made the lizardman lieutenant happy was that the people who had captured him didn't seem to want to kill him for the time being. Unfortunately, this was only one of the many pieces of bad news that seemed easier to accept. As a scout, Aekin knew that the scouts would sometimes catch some of the captives and let them live a little longer before they got the information they wanted. But in the end, there was only one outcome. The scouts would not bring a burden with them. This sounded a bit strange, but it was the truth. Sometimes, death was not the most terrible thing. If you didn't tell the truth, the cold-hearted scouts had many ways to make you taste a taste worse than death. As a veteran scout and an even more experienced lizard-man bandit, Aekin was not unfamiliar with what was going to happen next. However, it wasn't afraid because it was prepared to spill everything it knew as long as the other party interrogated it. Lizardmen did not have any moral integrity. And as a bandit, the lizardmen did not have any moral integrity. His hands and feet were tied tightly with a rope, but he still raised his head and carefully looked around. However, Aekin soon discovered a fact. If they wanted to catch some of the captives, they caught too few of them. The lizardman lieutenant saw that all of his subordinates were dead. For no more, no less. He was not stupid and immediately realized that his survival situation might be a bit dangerous. Then who were they? What did they want? While Aekin was thinking about this question, his vision suddenly darkened. The 2 humans and the silver elf who had captured him before were standing in front of him. The lizardman lieutenant immediately swallowed his saliva and rolled his eyes. If he could survive, he was willing to do anything. But the key was how to save his life. While he was thinking about this profound question, Brando was also staring at him. Because the Amber Sword was not a game that played according to common sense. In fact, the players who had moved from PCs to next-generation home consoles gradually figured out this rule after a lot of losses. Of course, this experience was gradually passed down through the process of accumulation. After experiencing the virtual world, Brando naturally learned how to adapt to the way the cards were played in this world. He first stood in front of the Lizard Man lieutenant, carefully looked at him, and then smiled slightly. He squatted down in front of Aiken, stretched out his hand and patted the lizardman's rough, narrow face and said gently, "I know," he said, "you're thinking about what I'm going to ask so you can tell me everything you know and then beg me to spare your life, right?" Aiken opened his mouth wide, revealing about 100 sharp teeth. He now felt as if he was ready to fight any enemy, but he didn't expect to be punched in the face by his opponent. The lizard man shook his head. He couldn't figure out how this human knew what he was thinking. Or did he have the ability to read his mind? But if he had such an ability, didn't that mean that his only chance of survival was gone? Aiken couldn't help but tremble. He didn't ask for a chance of survival, he just hoped that these terrible enemies wouldn't torture him before he died. He couldn't help but stare at Brando vigilantly with his prismatic pupils. "Are you afraid?" Brando asked again. When he said this, he heard a low snicker behind him. He recognized that it was the voices of the Roman and Amandina, as well as the Wild Elf sisters. Then most of the mercenaries of Lopez joined in. Brando couldn't help but feel a little annoyed. "Can't you see that I'm in the middle of something?" But he couldn't do anything about it. In fact, when he said this to the lizard man for the first time, everyone present was shocked. But after the second time and even the third time, they realized that their lord was just pretending to be mysterious. Perhaps these people didn't understand that Brando didn't have the ability to read minds, nor was he pretending to be mysterious. He had dealt with these bandits and robbers too many times, and he already knew their basic reactions like the back of his hand. Brando already knew which NPCs had integrity and which ones didn't. The lizard man Aiken didn't have the time to care about others. He was terrified by Brando, and he was almost certain that this human was a wizard. A wizard who could see through people's hearts. Of course, he still had a trace of doubt, but he saw Brando stand up and take out a ruby from his chest. He pointed at the lizard man and asked, "You can try answering my question." Aiken was skeptical, but when he opened his mouth, he found that he couldn't make a sound. Even though his mouth was still opening and closing, there wasn't a single sound. This time Aiken was really frightened. Even though wizards in this era were far less mysterious than they were in the Age of Chaos, the people in this remote mountain area still thought that these people held terrifying power. Aiken couldn't help but stare at Brando in a daze. He didn't understand why he stole his voice. But Brando held the ruby in his hand and dispelled the spell. He looked at the energy in the gemstone and saw that there were still 6 rounds left. Then he put away the gemstone and said to the lizard man with a serious face, "See? I can take away your ability to speak and I can also return it to you. Voice is a part of the soul. I can take away not only your voice but also your soul." The young man's voice turned cold. "The body will rot but the soul will live forever. Therefore the punishment and pain of life are usually temporary. Have you ever tasted the taste of eternal torment and flames?" Aiken shivered and quickly shook his head. Brando smiled gently and crouched down to touch the lizardman's forehead. "Then can you do me a favor?" The lizard man nodded repeatedly. "You mean they retreated to the southwest?" "Yes, boss. My men saw them retreating to the southwest valley. I don't know if they have discovered us." Aiken pushed open the door and entered the hall that belonged to Hugel. He saw one of his comrades reporting something to their boss who was sitting on a high chair in the middle. This scene made him nervous, but his survival instincts prevailed. He took a deep breath and sorted out his thoughts before walking forward. The lizard man who was reporting seemed to have finished what he wanted to say. Under Hugel's signal, he turned around and walked past Aiken and left the hall. The lizard man captain did not dare to look back or meet Hugel's gaze. He could only lower his head, but from the number of boots on the carpet, he could tell that there were 2 other people in the hall. In fact, he knew these 2 people. They were both humans, but they seemed to be friends with their boss. Aiken had seen them yesterday afternoon, but he knew that it was his boss's business and he didn't dare to ask. He recited what Brando told him in his heart. All Martha above, he swore that he had never been so serious even when reciting prayers. The threat of that human wizard still lingered in his ears. It was a matter of life and death. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com to read more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 174. At the same time, Conrad and the Dark Priest of the Black Flame Church were also sizing up the new lizard. But to their surprise, these low-level reptiles seemed to have the same face. At least in their eyes, this lizard, and the previous lizard, did not seem to be any different in appearance. Perhaps the pattern was different? On the other hand, Hugel recognized his subordinate and asked, "Ejin, you're back earlier than I expected. Did you find the target?" Hugel didn't need to use the awkward Kurlutz language and was able to speak fluently. "Yes, boss." Aekin lowered his head and replied fearfully. His attitude did not arouse Hugel's suspicion, as he had always required his subordinates to treat him with respect. However, the bandit leader was a little impatient. He waved his hand and replied, "When did you become so hesitant, Aekin? What did you see this time?" "It's like this, boss." The lizard man captain swallowed his saliva and stammered, "My men and I were ambushed in the south and we lost some men. The ambushers seemed to be those humans. There were a total of 15 of them, 2 women and a young man leading them. They were very powerful and we did not even have time to react before we lost 4 of our brothers." "South." Hugel was stunned as if he did not hear about the loss. "Are you sure it's south?" Aekin was startled as he thought that his boss would be furious. However, it quickly reacted and nodded. "What did he say?" Conrad was already impatient as he listened to the 2 lizard men chattering in their native language. When Hugel raised his voice, he knew that there was a problem. He immediately grabbed the lizardman's shoulder and asked. Hugel slapped his hand away and scolded, "This time it's the south." "That's great. Donald, is your opponent playing hide and seek with us?" "Southeast, south, southwest." The Dark Bishop was stunned. "This does not make sense. There must be a conspiracy." "Plot my ass." The lizard man bandit leader cursed. "The current situation is very simple. The enemy has already discovered your presence. That bullshit young man you sent to bite down on the other side must have been killed by the other side. Those humans are fleeing towards the south. Split into 3 groups. They are trying to distract us. I have seen this kind of trick many times." "Impossible." The Dark Bishop of the Black Fire sect almost jumped up. "My oracle went with that guy." He excitedly took out a crystal from his robe with his withered claw. "The crystal hasn't broken yet, which means that they are fine now. Then your foolish divine envoy must have gotten lost." Hugel coldly mocked. "An oracle can get lost? Are you farting, stupid lizard?" Conrad interrupted the lizard and turned back to stop the excited Dark Bishop. "Why are you being so impulsive?" he said angrily. From this point of view, the lizard was right. The other party had already discovered our intentions. They definitely won't run into us again. Escaping is inevitable, so we can't wait here any longer. Then what should we do? The Dark Bishop was stunned for a moment. "Of course we chase after them." "Which group?" Hugel asked in an annoyed tone. Conrad looked at it coldly and replied indifferently, "I said you're an idiot and you're really an idiot. Are there only the 3 of us here? Where are your subordinates? Of course we will split into 3 groups. Are you afraid that a mere dozen silver-ranked guards will be able to defeat us one by one?" Hugel was speechless. He opened his mouth but realized that the damned human was right. "Then when do we set off?" he asked in a weak tone. "Of course, immediately." The Dark Bishop replied. "No," Conrad stopped him, "we will wait for you and my men to arrive. We will set off at night." "You are too cautious, Conrad. This is not good." The low-ranking priest of the Disciples of the Black Flames had the same concern. After all, according to the report from the lizard men hunters, the enemy retreated a little too cautiously. Even so, the priest of the Disciples of the Black Flames muttered. Hugel glanced at the 2 of them and reminded them, "Don't forget that I have to take half of the credit for this matter." The 2 of them looked at the lizard man with a disdainful expression and snorted in disgust. They were not as shameless as him. However, none of the 3 big shots noticed that the lizard man Lieutenant Aekin, who had been keeping his head down the whole time, had secretly let out a sigh of relief. He thought to himself that this time, the terrifying wizard would finally return the soul that he had kept in captivity, right? What did the other party say? As long as he was not dead when the moon rose, it meant that his soul had returned to his body? Aekin could not help but feel apprehensive. That cunning wizard wouldn't go back on his words, right? He shuddered. Night quickly fell. Regardless of whether Aekin lost his soul when the moon rose, Conrad, Hugel, and the others began to move. A few miles away from the top of the hill near the Silver Elves' ruins, one could see torches lit up in the ruins below. It looked like a sea of fire. In fact, such a scene was not common in the past, because it meant that the Lizard Men bandits were about to make a big move. They were gathering. However, it was not easy to gather the Lizard Men together, especially when one had to reorganize more than 1,000 Lizard Men who lacked the basic concept of left and right. It was an even bigger project. About an hour later, another long line of torches appeared from the west and entered the Balagon ruins. The dots of torches quickly gathered together, and the gathered torches seemed to illuminate the sky in that direction. At the same time, 4 figures stood silently on the mountain. The disciples of the Black Flames have gathered. Brando whispered as his eyes reflected the light of the fire. Conrad's men are here too, Sanford added. Brando nodded. Are you sure they will split into 3 groups, my lord? Sanford turned back and asked, what if they form a single group? What if they see through our tricks? There are no ifs, Brando thought to himself. How could there be ifs with his ability to lure the Lizard Men? If he was facing the elite army, especially the army led by the talented commanders of Madara, his little tricks might not work. However, the Lizard Men bandits would definitely not be able to guess his intentions. He had a huge advantage. He knew how strong the Lizard Men were, but the Lizardmen's understanding of him was still limited to the 12 silver-ranked guards that Rady had described. Under these circumstances, no matter if it was the Lizard Men commander or Conrad of the Paper Cards mercenaries, none of them would have thought that Brendel's plan was to take all of them, and take a large amount of EXP. Even if Brando told them himself that he wanted to use only a dozen silver-ranked warriors to wipe out 1,000-strong group of bandits, they would probably think that he had lost his mind. However, Brando paused for a moment and turned back to answer, even in the worst-case scenario, they will only form a single group. But that is still better than us killing our way here. Remember, they are the hunters and we are the prey. In a hunt, the prey will always be the one deciding the direction, not the hunter. Sanford nodded in silence. The elven commander still stood at the side with a cold expression. At this distance, his strength was greatly limited. In truth, he could not see much more than Brando. The last person beside the 3 of them was the merchant girl. The Roman did not have the same direct understanding of the torches at the foot of the mountain. On the contrary, she felt that the torches were beautiful. They gathered together in the darkness and reflected in her eyes. It was like a painting made of flames, and she felt that it was exceptionally beautiful. However, Brando did not call her here just to see the fireworks. Soon, the torches began to scatter and finally separated into 3 straight lines. My lord, you guessed it right. Sanford's eyes lit up as he exclaimed in excitement. However, his expression suddenly turned gloomy. Brando's confidence reminded him of Makarov. If there was one person who could always lead the Grey Wolves mercenaries forward, it would definitely be Makarov. But it was a pity that the so-called forever was just wishful thinking. Compared to Sanford's emotional fluctuation, Brando was not surprised at all. The drama had just begun. He pointed down and asked, Roman, can you see what the leaders look like? Sanford and the Silver Elf commander were stunned. How was that possible? They were at least 7 to 8 miles away from the ruins of the Silver Elves. Looking down from the top of the mountain, the torches were as dim as fireflies, not to mention the people holding the torches. However, they immediately realized that the young lady who was with them was not an ordinary person. The Roman immediately nodded and said, Of course you can. There's a group of people on the left and the one in front looks like a lizard, Brendel. That's the Lizard Man commander, Hugel. Continue. Brando glanced at the Roman. He knew the merchant girl's ability very well. The last time she was in Fortress Reden, she was able to see Madara's army clearly even in the starless night. Now, with the moonlight and the light from the torches, it was easy to see the enemy's appearance. Then there's the one in the middle, the leader is a human. He's a young man wearing leather armor. There seems to be a strange thing following him. The Roman described the strange thing in detail. Brando immediately said, Conrad and the Angel of Earth. Strange, the 2 of them are together. Then who's the leader of the 3rd group? The young Roman? Romaine nodded as her gaze fell upon the 3rd group. She then described what she had seen to them. They're wearing long robes? Black with a few red stripes? I can't see clearly, Brando. Brando muttered, It's the Dark Bishop of the Blackfire Church. I didn't expect there to be such a person. It seems like the one who cursed Scarlet was him. I don't know how high his rank is, but according to Rady he shouldn't be higher than the mid-ranked. Then, my lord, should we continue with the original plan? Sanford asked. That was a problem. Brando's original plan was to get rid of the Angel of Earth, but now that the Angel of Earth was with Conrad, it would be a tough battle. Of course, the tough battle was secondary. He was afraid that he wouldn't be able to keep the Angel of Earth here. If he let the Angel of Earth escape, it would be troublesome. It was not impossible. The Angel of Earth was at least a LVL 50 boss, which was equivalent to a LVL 65 normal monster. In other words, the Angel of Earth was at least 5 levels higher than the Silver Elves under him. With the gold-ranked Conrad supporting them from the side, it wouldn't be easy to keep them here. Luring the Angel of Earth would only work once. The Angel of Earth was not an idiot who would fall into the same trap repeatedly. That was why he had to get the most out of it this time. Brando stroked his chin and felt a little troubled. What should he do? Killing the lizard men and the Dark Bishop didn't seem to affect him at all. But wait, the Dark Bishop? Another thought occurred to him at once. What the devil? That was the Dark Bishop. What was a Dark Bishop? Wasn't that a Dark Elementalist? Brando almost wanted to hit himself on the head. He felt that he was really an idiot. He didn't realize that killing the Dark Bishop would give him a lot of Dark Elemental crystals. Indeed, the Dark Bishop of the Disciples of the Black Flames was called a pauper by the players in the game because he would not drop anything other than Dark Elemental crystals when he died. Brando was influenced by his thoughts and forgot that the Dark Elemental crystals were what he needed now. Once he thought of this, the young man felt that his mind was suddenly opened up. Once the Dark Bishop was killed, the blood of gods in scarlet would be temporarily suppressed because of the loss of control. Wouldn't that mean that he would have another powerful warrior in his hands? So he immediately clapped his hands and replied, "No, let's start with the Dark Bishop first." Everyone was stunned. They didn't understand why the young lord's plan changed so suddenly. But Brando patted the head of his hunting dragon and made it turn around. At the same time he smiled awkwardly and said, "Sometimes there will be some changes in the plan. This is normal. Don't worry, this won't affect anything. Anyway, let's go back to the ambush location. I don't plan to fight with them here." To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com to read more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 175. 4 hunting dragons traveled through the darkness. Their faint shadows were like flowing water across the valley. The rider in the lead raised his hand high. The knights stopped abruptly, turned around in unison, and dismounted from their horses one after another. One of his hands was on the hilt of his sword, and his thigh crossed over a saddle made of some unknown leather. When his foot touched the ground, he heard Romaine's complaints as she shook her body on the back of the hunter dragon. "Brando, it's so uncomfortable to ride this thing." The merchant girl frowned and said with one hand on her neck, "It's not exciting at all." Brando smiled and walked over to help the girl down from the hunting dragon. He thought to himself, how can our Roman lady follow me obediently? The hunting dragon was a 2-legged reptile. When it moved forward, its spine would twist in Anne's shape. If the rider did not undergo specialized training, it would be strange if they had a good time. Otherwise, why would he waste dozens of EXP to learn this skill from the lizardmen captives? He had been tricked once in the game, so why would he step into the same trap again? But when the young man saw that his female companion's face was not looking good, he could not bear to see her like this. He replied gently, "You should go and rest. After all, the Roman would not be able to interfere in the upcoming battle. Then I'll go to sleep." The Roman jumped down from his arm and winked at him. "I'll pray for you, Brando." "In a dream?" Brando asked impatiently. "Yes, in a dream." The girl nodded seriously. She smiled and her bright eyes narrowed into an arc. She looked at him as if she had won a small victory. She turned around and ran past Lopez, who was walking out of the forest. Brando also smiled in his heart. He liked the merchant girl's optimistic attitude no matter what kind of adversity she was in. That night in Bucci, the Roman's first action had deeply attracted him. It was undeniable that he had inherited Brando's emotions, but the merchant girl had also conquered his modern side. He took a deep breath and the cold night air immediately seeped into his lungs. His slightly feverish head gradually calmed down. When the young man saw the night-song tiger among the mercenaries, he paused for a moment before gesturing to the experienced mercenary leader. "Go back and prepare, the enemy is less than 5 miles away from us. Hurry up, there are more than 200 lizards. I want all the experience points left." Brando didn't like to talk too much before a battle. He had already made it clear that this was just a small ambush. Compared to the past in the game, it couldn't even compare to a slightly larger scale team activity. Experience? Sanford dizzily jumped down from the hunting dragon's back and caught the phrase that he didn't understand. The Nightsong Tiger glanced at the young man and pursed his lips. In fact, he was already used to the strange words that came out of his lord's mouth from time to time. Not only him, but those who had spent some time with Brando were already used to it and even learned a lot from him. I'm talking about the enemy. Brando corrected himself with a straight face. The Silver Elf commander glanced at him and the corner of his mouth twitched slightly. Brando's order was quickly carried out. The group returned to the forest on the hillside and the young man began to arrange the battle strategy. Facing a group of level 20 enemies, Brando decided to use the most common method in the game, divide and conquer. He, the Nightsong Tiger, and the Silver Elf commander hid in the forest and looked down at the Silver Elf guards and mercenaries. As the most professional warriors from the War of the Holy Saints, the Silver Elves' armor were all polished by experienced elven craftsmen, so there was no need to worry about it reflecting the moonlight. The mercenaries, on the other hand, were mostly wearing light leather armor. Even their chainmail was painted black, so there was no need to worry about it. The elves lined up behind the bushes and squatted down, holding their double-ended swords with one hand. Due to the same concern, their swords were also covered with dried leaves. About 30 feet behind them, the mercenaries were nervously holding their crossbows, not daring to even breathe. In fact, Brando did not want to have any casualties in this battle, so he let the elven guards be the vanguard while the mercenaries were only responsible for suppressing the enemy from a distance. His subconscious action to reduce the number of casualties was seen by the new Grey Wolves mercenaries as an act of compassion for his subordinates. Although Maned Wolf, Makarov was able to bring them victory time and time again, as a noble commander, their common mistake was to treat the casualties of their subordinates as mere numbers. In Wond, whose productivity far exceeded that of Earth in the Middle Ages, manpower was always a number in the eyes of a commander. However, Brando was born in the game, and as a player, every NPC deployment was bought with real money. Some of them were even obtained from special missions. It could be said that every NPC deployment was not easy to obtain, so naturally, they would not be willing to sacrifice them like cannon fodder. Of course, Brando did not realize that his subconscious action had aroused the loyalty of the new Grey Wolves mercenaries. He only took out his pocket watch and estimated the time. At most there was an hour left. He gently exhaled and shook his body to warm himself up in the cold forest before dawn. But he couldn't help but feel a little amused. It was just a small battle, but he actually felt a little nervous. Ever since he joined Grace's divine force to fight against Madara, he was always in command of 3 to 4 regiments. What kind of big battle had he not seen before? Even before he transmigrated to this world, he was still laughing at those timid newbies. He did not expect that one day he would be acting like a newbie in his first battle. But even though he thought so, he could not help but feel his blood rushing through his veins when he looked through the forest that was bathed in white moonlight. This was not his first battle in this world, but it had been a long time since he hid in a forest all night just to wait for members of an enemy guild to pass by. He looked at the green numbers that were constantly changing in his vision. He knew that thing. In the game they called it the distance calculation tool. It was used to calculate the casting distance and shooting distance penalty. But at this moment it seemed so unreal. Brendel paused for a moment, and decided to familiarize himself with his stats. Strength 19. 4 plus 0. 1. Dexterity 10. 9 plus 1. 1. Vitality 21. 2 plus 2. Intelligence 1. 1 will 3. 6 plus 1. Wisdom 3. 9. Asterisk in brackets, equipment or other sources of attributes have been included in the total attributes. His attributes were infinitely close to the strength of a silver tier. Just one more level and Brando was confident that he would be able to enter that realm. However, compared to his basic attributes, his skills were much stronger. In this life he was in a much better situation compared to his previous life. The White Raven Sword style and Strength Burst could be said to be one of the few skills that provided the greatest boost to a combatant in the early stages of the game. Brando could not imagine how he survived when he was only level 20 in his previous life by relying on a few basic skills. One must know that at this moment, with his experience and skills, it was easy for him to fight against enemies of the same level. He estimated his true strength. Even if he did not rely on his experience and skills, he could still reach the level of a silver tier. Of course, if he used his experience in the game, it would be impossible to measure. When facing different opponents, he might even be able to defeat a gold-tier player. But for those who were difficult to deal with, sometimes experience and skills would not be of much use. Thinking of this, he suddenly turned around and asked, "Your battle skills came from the sacred land, right?" The silver elf commander was slightly stunned, and then looked at him with some vigilance. "Don't worry, I know your rules. I'm not interested in your elven battle skills, I'm just casually asking." Brando thought to himself. Of course I'm interested, it's just that I don't have enough reputation. Even if I tell you, you won't be able to learn it. The battle skills of the silver elves are tailor-made for my people, human. The silver elf turned around coldly. Brando despised the silver elf in his heart. He thought to himself that this guy who was as cold as an iceberg on the surface was also a hypocrite. If he did not know, it would be fine. Unfortunately, the silver elf commander probably did not know that he had learned the silver elf battle skills before, and more than one type. But of course the young man would not say it out loud. He just smiled. "Don't be so heartless. You're called Nalathar, right? You've experienced the War of the Holy Saints?" The silver elf glanced at him. He did not understand how the topic changed, but he still nodded. "Then have you learned any dark battle skills?" "I don't." Nalathar answered firmly and coldly glanced at Brando. His lips moved, but he held back. In fact, there was only one type of silver elf that had learned dark battle skills, and that was the dark elf army under the dark dragon. Although he thought that Brando was deliberately mocking him, the silver elf commander thought for a moment and told himself that it was an unintentional mistake. Very few people in this era would know the secrets of that era. But Nalathar did not know that Brando was one of those few. Although he did not know if he was still considered human in his current state. After all, a person's body would not have two souls, and there would be some strange numbers on his retina. Nalathar was silent for a moment and suddenly said, "Do you really want to learn something, human?" This time it was Brando's turn to be stunned. He opened his mouth and did not know how to answer. "You really want to teach? You're not playing with me, right?" Brando clearly remembered that the reputation of the Silver Elves was the hardest to raise. P.S. Previously, due to various reasons, I was not very supportive and did not have the face to ask for votes. Now that I've recovered, I can finally ask for some support. Everyone's support has really moved me to death. In just a few days, my monthly votes have increased by more than 400, and the number of friends who have tipped me has increased by 76. According to international practice, I should have a list to thank everyone, but I've never figured out how they did it. I have no choice but to thank everyone for their support. Although I can't list them one by one, I pay attention to each of them every day. Thank you again. To be continued. If you want to know the future, please go to www.chidian.com. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 176. You don't want to? Nalathar looked back at him, his eyes full of ridicule. Yes, of course I do. Brando quickly replied. Nonsense, who wouldn't want to learn the Elven Holy Land's battle techniques? Only an idiot. I can't teach you Elven battle techniques, so don't even think about it. Nalathar looked at him calmly and replied, Don't worry, I've already said that the Silver Elves' battle techniques are tailor-made for my people. Brando nodded, but he didn't think much of it. Then, I can teach you something that we understand ourselves. The Silver Elf paused for a moment. You know, learning how to judge the strength of your enemies on the battlefield is very important. Wait. Brando took a deep breath and interrupted him. You said inspect? The youth tried his best to calm himself down and asked. What a joke, that's an inspect skill. Looking at this cold Silver Elf now, he felt that she had become more amiable. After getting used to using numbers to measure strength, it was a little awkward for him to be like an NPC and use ranks to differentiate enemies. Moreover, without the inspect skill, there was no way to know what skills the enemy had. Of course, experience could provide some information, but it wasn't accurate for humanoid creatures. Brando wasn't arrogant enough to think that he could remember the skills of thousands of NPCs and their battle techniques. In the game, Martin should have taught him the inspect skill, but when Brando asked the veteran in Brags, he found that the veteran didn't know the skill at all. He thought for a moment. When he met the veteran in the game, it was already very late in the game, so it wasn't impossible for Martin to have learned the skill from someone else during that time. But after losing this clue, he found that it was unrealistic to find someone else to learn the skill. They were either too far away, or they were on the enemy's side. And now that Brando finally had a large amount of experience, he found that he had lost the opportunity to learn these skills. He had been worrying about this problem for a while now, and Nalathar had come knocking on his door. It had to be known that Identify was a skill that could be used to search others. It could see a character's basic stats and most commonly used skills. At higher levels, it could even evaluate a character's absolute strength. Using it to determine the strength of an enemy was far too easy. But when he looked hopefully at the Silver Elf, he saw the Silver Elf shake her head. Probing? Nalaethes replied, "The name we gave to this ability is Deep Analysis." What? Brando was stunned. What in-depth analysis? He had never heard of it before. He knew that there was an advanced version of Inspect, called Eagle Eye. This skill was so overpowered that not only did it have the same effect as Inspect, but it also had a chance to steal skills from the enemies it killed. Unfortunately, Eagle Eye was Baron Bernargis's specialty, and the reputation required to teach this skill had to be at least ally rank. The problem was that this old man was Erwin's strongest opponent, the archenemy of Princess Griffin. In his previous life, how could Brando run over to him to farm reputation? Not to mention the price he would have to pay for doing so, he reckoned that his senior captain would have had a real-life PK with him first. Deep Analysis. Nalaethes repeated, "This is actually a skill that every Silver Elf warrior knows. We use it to control the situation on the battlefield." Then what is it used for? Brando heard that this was a skill that every Silver Elf warrior knew, and his interest was piqued. As far as he knew, the Silver Elves were natural warriors. Their knowledge of battle and techniques was definitely not weak. The Silver Elf commander stared at Brando and replied, "I remember you said that you would bring victory to us. You even asked me to record this sentence. Then I will remember it. This skill is equivalent to a bet. If you keep your word, I will teach you this skill." He turned around and smiled when Brando did not notice. Damn. I knew it wouldn't be that simple. Brando cursed in his heart. But it didn't matter. Whether it was the victory of this battle or the skill, he was sure to obtain it. He wanted to know what kind of skill Deep Analysis was. After playing the game for more than 10 years in his previous life, there were very few skills in this game that he did not know. Of course, other than Planeswalkers and Cards of Fate. At this time he felt the Nightsong Tiger's elbow touch him. He raised his head and noticed that the mercenaries below had become restless. Although it was only for a moment, it was enough for him to sense that something was wrong. The long-awaited enemy had arrived. The first to enter the valley were the Lizardmen's dragon hunters. There were about 30 of them. Stepping on the cold rocks under the moonlight, they soon crossed the bottom of the valley. Then came a large number of Lizardmen infantry carrying spears and crossbows. Because they were not a regular army, these monsters did not have any neat equipment, nor did they have any flags. The division leaders wore armbands and commanded the troops nearby to maintain order. They were shouting and making unclear high-frequency calls so that the disorderly monsters would not scatter the formation too much. Because this place was still far from the place where the scouts had reported that they had encountered the humans, the lizard men did not spread out their formation. Instead, they maintained 2 or 3 rows as they passed through the valley. The mercenaries looked back at Brando and waited for him to give the order to attack. But Brando shook his head and told them to let go of the first half of the lizardmen army. It was not the time to attack yet. Soon the Dark Bishop entered the battlefield. Because he was not a physical class, he did not appear at the front or the sides of the formation. Instead, he was surrounded by a group of disciples of the Black Flames. Brando did not even need to think to know that they were all high-ranked disciples. He also saw a few tall one-armed demons walking in the middle of these disciples. They were Bacheza. Legend said that if a warrior's soul fell into hell, they would become a Bacheza demon. They were also one of the few low-ranked demons that had strong offensive abilities. The first half of the Lizardmen army had already been let go. Brando suddenly looked around and asked, "Where is Amandina?" Miss Amandina was called away by Miss Roman. The Nightsong Tiger replied. The young man replied with an, "Oh." He was still a little worried that Roman, that damn girl, would cause some trouble without anyone to control her. But when he heard that Amandina was with her, he felt a little more at ease. The only thing left was to deal with the upcoming battle. He stared at the valley. The lizard men did not notice the killing intent hidden on the hillside at all. The young man pulled out his sword. The blade was dark and did not reflect any light. He pointed the sword downwards. This was the signal to attack. The night's massacre began with the powerful vibrations of the 4-armed crossbow strings. The mercenaries placed the handles of these weapons on their shoulders and aimed at their prey. They clenched their teeth and pulled the trigger. The metal wire quickly returned to its original state after losing its restraints. Clang clang. A series of muffled sounds rang out. At the same time, a cloud of dust rose from the crossbow. At the same time, the elastic potential energy of the crossbow was transformed into a powerful kinetic energy. The battle had begun. From the lizardman's point of view, a dozen lines extended from the forest on one side of the slope, accompanied by a series of muffled noises. They only had time to turn their heads before they saw more than 10 of their comrades fall to the ground. They were all armed with crossbows. Although most of these lizard men were not killed by the crossbow bolts, the huge impact of the crossbow bolts still caused them to lose their ability to fight for a while. Ambush. The lizard men who had not fully evolved instinctively wanted to enter battle mode, but the second wave of attacks came as expected. The lizard men crossbowmen who were capable of long-range attacks were targeted one by one. Panic descended upon the lizard men like a calamity. The bushes on the hillside parted to the left and right, and a row of elven warriors wearing silver armor and wielding double-ended swords came out from behind. Although there were only 20 of them, they moved in an orderly manner as if they were still on the battlefield 7 centuries ago. Behind them was the army of the Silver Elf Empire, Heron. They were imposing. The low-ranking Dark Bishop of the Blackfire Church was shocked when he saw this scene. He thought that the lizardman's act of prying into the Silver Elf King's tomb had angered the ancient empire, causing this race that had been hidden for hundreds of years to reappear in this world. When the Silver Elf warriors appeared, he had the urge to kill that damned Hugel of the lizardmen. What a joke. They were the Silver Elves who had won the War of the Holy Saints. The Dark Bishop felt his hands tremble when he saw 20 gold-ranked warriors. He hoped that the lizardmen cannon fodder below could buy him some time, but it seemed that the situation would only get worse. When the first group of Silver Elves charged into the lizardmen, the huge impact threw the skinny lizardmen into the air. Even if they did not die, they would be heavily injured. The fully armed elven heavy infantry directly opened up a path among the lizardmen and trampled over the lizardmen who had yet to get up. The battle was not constructive. Although the lizardmen outnumbered the Silver Elves by 10 to 1, it was a one-sided slaughter for the Gold Elves against the Iron Elves. When the Elven guards charged forward, the mercenaries were reloading their crossbows for the third round of arrows. At this time, Brando, the Nightsong Tiger, and the Silver Elf commander also charged forward. The fastest of the three was undoubtedly Brando. The young man noticed that something was amiss from the start of the battle. Of course, it was not bad news. On the contrary, he noticed that his experience points were increasing rapidly. Logically speaking, although the mercenaries of Lopez and the Grey Wolves mercenaries were his summoned creatures and subordinates, the Silver Elves were the ones who dealt the most damage. These elves were his allies. In other words, they were in a party. Logically speaking, with so many high-level characters, the Silver Elves were level 40 at this time, the amount of experience points he could share should be very little. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.gdn.com to read more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 177. But after a short pause, he finally realized what was going on. Holy shit, a perfect story with bonus EXP. So there really is such a thing. He could no longer sit still and activated his charge skill. Like a blur, he passed by the Nightsong Tiger, the Elven commander, the mercenaries, and the Elven guards and stopped in front of a row of lizardmen spearmen. He raised his head and saw a row of lizardmen soldiers approaching him. Good timing. Brando shouted in his mind. He raised his sword and blocked the 2 spears that were coming at him with a clang. Even though he was level 24, his combat power was far beyond that of a normal level 30 NPC. The lizardmen spearmen were level 19 monsters and they were no match for him. Brando did not even need to look at the enemy's appearance. He immediately used Strength Burst, and the 2 lizardmen spearmen screamed and flew backward. The young man took another step forward and pulled the sword from right to left with both hands. The wind pressure seemed to have dislocated the space in an instant, and a 7-meter-long transparent ripple whizzed across the upper half of the lizardmen's bodies. It was like the scenery he saw in the mountains of Grinoires, where the wind blew through the mountain meadows, causing the grass to fall back. A number appeared in his vision, and the lizardmen in front of him were split into 2 and fell backward. The scene was similar to the time when Medisha was chasing after him and the Nightsong Tiger, and the entire battlefield was silent. Wind pressure could be used to injure people outside of elemental activation, and only a few combat skills could do that. Medicia's spirit spear was actually a skill derived from the Ghost Knight, and the average elven warrior would not be able to use it. Even a lower gold elven warrior would not be able to use it. Only when they were at their peak and had activated their elemental activation would they be able to use it. Brando sheathed his sword and let out a sigh of relief. He had only killed 6 or 7 lizard men with his sword, but the impact was huge. He saw the morale value above the heads of the lizard men warriors close to him drop to a red alert value. Then, one after another, the lizard men warriors circled around him, forming a vacuum around him. This gave Brando time to check his experience points. He found that the 7 lizard men spearmen he had killed before had given him 60 experience points each. Normally, killing a level 19 monster would only give him a little more than 20 experience points. This was close to 3 times the amount he had gained in the game. Brando felt his blood boiling. He was already at 32007900 EXP, and he was only halfway to level 25. When the Silver Elves crashed into the group of lizard men, his experience had increased by more than 200 points. In addition, the 7 lizard men had given him 420 experience points. He estimated that if he killed another 20 to 30 lizard men, wouldn't he be able to level up? Level 25 was a watershed. Not only could he obtain a second talent, but he could also obtain a third-class skill that came with it. Moreover, once he reached level 25, he would have the strength of a silver tier. At the age of 19 he had the strength of a silver tier. This was already the standard of an enlightened one. I don't have to feel inferior when I see a genius anymore, right? Even though I've never felt inferior before, but I can't help but feel a little annoyed when I see geniuses running rampant in this era. Moreover, if a level 19 lizard man spearman gave 60 experience points, then what about a level 22 lizard man crossbowman and a level 23 elite lizard man warrior? Not to mention a level 25 dragon knight, a disciple of the Black Flame, and that dark bishop. When Brando thought of the dark bishop, he couldn't help but feel his blood boil. His eyes turned red and he couldn't help but look around, trying to find where the experience points were. However, the first thing Brando saw was a group of high-grade disciples of the Black Flame surging forward like a tidal wave. He immediately realized that the Dark Bishop didn't want them to break through the center of the formation and split the Lizardmen army into 2. This was because the Dark Bishop knew that once the Lizardmen army was split, it would be difficult to protect both the front and the back. Unless he had the determination to cut off his losses, it would be useless. He was a spellcaster, and he needed to rely on protection to escape from this chaotic battlefield. He had no choice but to move his high-grade disciples of the Black Flame to the center to stabilize the defensive line. More than 10 disciples of the Black Flame Knights wearing black robes and riding on lesser demons waved their flails as they charged forward. Unfortunately, at this time, the Silver Elves in silver armor had already rushed forward and stood side by side with Brando. The surrounding lizard men who wanted to surround them were continuously attacked by the mercenaries. If the Dark Bishop who commanded all of this was a little calmer, he would be able to command the lizard men to give up on protecting him and attack Brando's long-range formation. The situation would probably be better. Unfortunately, the art of command was not the Dark Bishop's specialty, and he could only subconsciously order the lizard men and disciples of the Black Flame to stay close to him. On one hand he wanted to avoid being separated, and on the other hand he wanted to protect himself better. He had to start preparing his spells. Unfortunately, Brando's reaction was faster than his. The sounds of battle in the valley had already become one. Amandina couldn't help but shiver when the wind swept across the bare cliffs without any vegetation. She felt as if the bottom of the mountain was in another world. She coughed lightly and used her hands to wrap the shawl around her body. The noble lady stood alone outside the cliff. She looked around fearfully, then frowned and looked worriedly into the deep crevice. After hesitating for a long time, she asked in a soft voice, "What's the matter? Roman, is it not done yet?" "It's almost done." Romain's matter-of-fact voice came from inside. Amandina sighed. She had already heard this answer several times, but she knew that Romain would definitely ignore her complaints. She could only stomp her feet to dispel the chill in her body. But this time Roman seemed to be almost done. She walked along the crevice for a while without relying on any light source, as if the darkness was a dear friend to her. However, most ordinary people would subconsciously feel afraid in such a narrow and dark environment. This young lady, on the other hand, looked very interested. She then took out a piece of crystal from her pocket, bent down and rummaged under the gravel for a while, and put the crystal in. She turned around and counted with her fingers. She seriously counted around 5 similar places, nodded, and calmly retreated. As soon as she walked out of the crevice, she saw Amandina's frown and resentful eyes. I regret it, Roman. Let's go back. Amandina lowered her head and coughed. Don't worry, it's just an experiment. Brando won't find out. Roman's face was full of pride. She grabbed Amandina's hand and walked forward. Let's go to the next place. Wait, give me some more of that, Amandina. What are you doing? Amandina hurriedly covered her bag. She was already unlucky enough to let this girl discover her secret, and she did not want to go crazy with this merchant girl. Is there a problem with the calculations? Of course. Amandina gritted her teeth and replied, Roman, you despicable woman. I was once an honorary student of the Royal Geographical Society of Lantanailan. Amandina immediately sighed in disappointment. A wind bullet, a fireball. When the swollen and hot air dispersed from the battlefield, the dozen or so high-ranking disciples of the Black Flame sect had already turned into ashes. As an explosive magic item, the Ring of the Wind Empress's energy was 20 OZ, and damage was 30. It was almost equivalent to the peak of Iron rank, and its impact was close to that of a lower Silver rank. The fireball's energy was 24 OZ, and damage was 70. It was equivalent to a lower Silver rank, and the area of effect was around the middle of the Silver rank. It was normal for the disciples of the Black Flames to be killed by a combo attack. Brando was worried that there would be troublesome high-ranked disciples like the Lord of Spiked Chains on the battlefield, but it seemed that his worry was unnecessary. The Lord of Spiked Chains was an elite among low-ranked demons, and it was impossible for a large number of them to appear in this world, unless the demonic gate reopened. After the smoke cleared, Brando's experience increased by almost 2,000 points. He was only one step away from level 25. He immediately put down his sword and ordered the Silver Elves beside him, attack the left and right sides and separate the Lizardmen. The boss in the middle? No, I mean their leader. Leave it to me. Do you understand? The 20 Silver Elves nodded in unison. What about me, my lord? The Nightsong Tiger asked. You and Nalathar will lead one side each. Brando replied. You don't need help? The Silver Elven commander rarely spoke. Leave it to me. I don't want that guy to die so quickly. Brando replied, but he had other thoughts in his mind. Even though the low-ranked Dark Bishop was called a pauper, he was still a level 25 elite creature. His strength was equivalent to a level 35 unit. Of course, the only difference was that it would be difficult for him to deal with a level 35 creature, but it would be much easier for him to deal with a level 25 elite creature. Moreover, that was a sizable amount of experience. The young man did not give the other two a chance to refute and went for the kill alone. In front of him were 2 Bacheza demons that were almost 3 meters tall. These creatures were very strong because they had the ability to charge. It could be said that they were a nightmare for low-ranked archers and wizards. Unfortunately, Brando was neither an archer nor a wizard, but a warrior. He rushed in front of the 2 demons, and before they could raise their swords and land a heavy blow on his head, he had already circled behind them like a ghost. The Bacheza demon was a level 24 creature. Its strength was 14 ounces, but its dexterity was a pitiful 7 ounces, which was almost half of Brando's when he was in his berserk state. The only thing it could be proud of was its thick skin and chargeability. In front of the young man, Brando's sword cut open a hole in its back, and then once again followed the movement of the clumsy creature and flashed behind it. Once again he was behind it and then another strike. This pitiful Bacheza demon was almost tortured to death and humiliation. Even until its blood ran dry, it did not see what its enemy looked like. At this time, the Dark Bishop of the Disciples of the Black Flames finally finished preparing his spell. He screamed and threw a black lightning at Brando. This thing was not as simple as lightning. Brando knew that this spell was called Demon's Claw. This was actually a 2D spell. Its main effect was to cause damage. It used the dark element to transform into hellfire damage. Then there was the following deceleration. As a level 3 spell, this deceleration was not as simple as Ice Break Arrow. On the contrary, it would firmly fix the person to the ground. If your strength did not exceed 40 ounces, then you would have to be prepared to be beaten within a minute and a half. This spell could be said to be one of the most practical early-stage spells for dark elementalists, evil priests and witches. It was especially useful for sneak attacks. Unfortunately, Brando wanted to tell the Dark Bishop that this spell was not meant to be used like this. Although in the early stages of the game, most players liked to cast spells in such a crude way without any modification. But in fact, the best way to use this spell was to use a light-bending spell to hide all of its light effects, or simply use it at close range. This was because this demon's claw needed to be aimed. Brendel swung his sword and sent the Bacheza demon's corpse flying, blocking the snake-like black lightning in midair. The lightning struck the Bacheza demon's body and immediately exploded into tens of thousands of black electric arcs that swept across the two sides of the cold corpse, locking it to the ground. The whole process was as black as ink and the scene was spectacular. Unfortunately, the spell's effect was 0 against the real target. At this moment, Brando had already raised his long sword. Strength burst, and the Ghost Knight's crystal's 30-ounce strength directly sent the remaining Bacheza demon's head and arm flying into the air. He took a deep breath. Even though strength burst was powerful, it also consumed a lot of stamina. Fortunately, when the ball of light from the demon entered his body, a warm current immediately flowed from his heart to his limbs and bones. A row of green words immediately appeared on the young man's retina. Character has reached level 25, entering the stage of activating fate. Character has obtained the skill Frontal Breakthrough. Frontal Breakthrough, level 0. Consume 5 times stamina to break the opponent's defense, armor, innate, magic, in the next attack, reducing 1/7 damage immunity. Detected a fate item Golden Truth of Fate, nearby. Do you wish to activate the fate talent, Golden Revelation? Brando was stunned. What kind of joke was this? He hurriedly shook his head. No, I refuse to activate it. P.S. Corrected a mistake. First, it was mentioned in the previous chapter that the main character was level 23, but he was actually level 24. I forgot to check his stats when writing, so now I have to correct it. Thus, Brando will be able to activate the fate talent at level 25. Also, when I arrived at my uncle's house, I thought that I wouldn't be able to write 3 chapters today, but in the end, I still managed to write it. 233. To be continued. If you want to know what happened next, please go to www.chidian.com. There are even more chapters. Chapter 178. The Golden Apple was one of the mythical special items in the past. The golden apocalypse that was born from it was the leaf of the golden tree. This golden tree was not the useless golden demonic tree that Brando had encountered. The real golden tree was actually a special name that referred to the world tree, Mana, that grew on the banks of the Abyss Lake and under the world summit. Mana could indeed be said to be one of the origins of the golden bloodline in this world of Wond. The talent that was bestowed by its leaf was a 10% increase in all attributes and a 10-fold increase in mental strength. Even in Brando's previous life, the young people only knew of a few top elementalists who had such a talent through quests. If it was in the past, he would only fantasize about the golden apple in his dreams. But at this moment, such an opportunity was in front of him, almost within reach. All he had to do was nod his head, and from then on, his strength, constitution, dexterity, willpower, and perception growth from all classes would be increased by 10%. Furthermore, the 10-fold increase in spiritual power meant that his mana pool would be doubled. At the same time, the number of spells that could be chanted at the same time would be increased by 3. This talent could be said to be a blessing for all spellcasting classes, especially for elementalists who were close to the elements of nature. That was why it had another name, Fairy Language. This talent was unanimously rated as S+ on authoritative analysis websites, although it was slightly inferior to Brando's current warrior class. But the latter also understood that he would eventually have to take on the elementalist class to complete the deck that he had set for himself, the Tyrant of all classes Planeswalker. Coupled with the characteristic of this talent that increased all attributes, it seemed to be particularly suitable for him. But he did not hesitate for a moment and firmly shook his head. Although the golden leaf was good, it was still different from his previous life. Brando deeply understood that in this world he only had one chance. Once he made a decision, there was no room for regret. What he wanted could only be the best, or the talent that was most in line with his plan. In his previous life he might not have such a choice, but it was different here. After losing the competition of other players, Brando understood that now there were many opportunities in front of him. And the golden leaf was just one of them that looked better. He had 2 goals. One of them was a primordial being, which increased all stats by 10% and reduced the penalty for subclasses by 50%. This was an S- grade talent, but the latter attribute was simply too important for him, who didn't know how many professions he would take on in the future. Could even be said that it was precious. The second one was the legendary Twin Union. This Destiny talent could be said to be one of the most legendary talents in the Amber Sword in the past. It was different from the other talents that were rated S and above. This S-rank talent only had one attribute. However, with just this attribute alone, it was enough to stand out from the many A-grade talents. The attribute of the Twin Pact was that it would increase the user's profession by one exclusive ability. Ancient Battle Skills. Any battle skill possessed by a warrior will have its maximum mastery increased by 1 level. Ancient Battle Skills. Any battle skill possessed by a warrior will have its maximum mastery increased by 1 level. In the past, a skill from level 1 to level 5 was called Beginner, level 5 to level 10 was Advanced, and after level 10 was Expert. Most non-specialized skills would be upgraded to level 15 when they reached the peak of Expert. Only specialized skills could be upgraded to level 15, which would be Master and Grandmaster. After Elemental Activation, skills that reached Grandmaster could be further upgraded with elemental points, but it would stop at the Ancient Sacred Lands stage. However, there was only one way for a warrior to upgrade a skill to Legendary, and that was through the exclusive ability provided by the Twin Pact. However, once a skill reached Legendary, even an intermediate skill would be comparable to an advanced skill. Therefore, there were also people who hypothesized that a character with both advanced skills and Twin Pact talents would have an advanced skill after Legendary. However, this was ultimately just a hypothesis because advanced skills and Twin Pact were both unattainable. Even a RMB warrior would not be able to win against them. At this time they could only rely on the strongest force among the players, the face fighter. However, to be able to use the Twin Pact and possess advanced skills, and the advanced skill had to be compatible with his own elemental activation, only then could he invest elemental points into it. A person with such a good face would have probably traveled to another world to conquer the world. Therefore, Brando had never seen such a person before. And because the Twin Pact was so rare and powerful, it was often called a pseudo-SS talent for fate by players who liked to take on more than 10 professions. It could be said that above the Twin Union, there were only a few SS talents that were crowned with powerful titles such as Son of Marcia and Calamity of the Azure. These talents only existed in rumors and had never appeared before. I'm not a greedy person. I don't wish for things that I've never seen before, even though I suspect that they are made up by the players. But to me, the Twin Union or even the Primordial Era is more than enough. Moreover, he also had a way to obtain these two talents. After all, as long as someone obtained them before, he could copy them and complete them again. Of course, the Golden Leaf was definitely not enough. He would definitely not use up his one and only chance to choose something that was not suitable for him because of impatience. Previously, when he was in Buchi, he chose the Indomitable talent because it was a matter of life and death. Thinking about it now, he regretted it for a long time. After all, if he had chosen the Descendant of the Dragon or the Will of the Bloodline, his battle strength would have increased by at least 20% to 30%. I refuse to use it, Brando replied in his heart. At the same time, he changed his direction and dodged a pure dark magic arrow that the Dark Bishop threw at him. To be honest, if this spell hit the current Brando, it would only break 1 or 2 of his bones. Moreover, with the nimbleness of a young man, the Dark Bishop did not even need to look to know that he would not be able to hit the target. However, both sides knew that the advantage of the magic arrow was that it was very fast and did not require any chanting time. The Dark Bishop only wanted to use this low circle spell to force Brando to change his direction and prevent him from getting too close to him. The disciples of the Black Flames who were originally scattered around the Dark Bishop were all either dead or injured. The only ones left were a dozen or so trembling lizardmen warriors. The Dark Bishop knew that these things were useless against Brando. He could only grit his teeth and rely on his own strength, even though the situation seemed to be unchangeable. As he threw the second magic arrow, he cursed the lizardmen warriors in his heart. How did the 20 silver elves kill their way out? In fact, until now he still did not realize that he had been tricked from the start. Brando was not in a hurry. He thought to himself, if he were 5 levels higher and advanced to an elven envoy, obtain the exclusive passive skill Spirit Pulse, and learn Dual Chant, then you would be casting magic arrows while charging up for other spells. I reckon I would have to worry about that. But what's the use of constantly using low-level spells to exhaust my physical strength? Could it be that your magic power is more abundant than my physical strength? At the same time, the young man noticed that the green option on his retina was fading away, and soon another message appeared. Detected that the character has reached level 25, the Bloodline talent has been unlocked for the second time. Unyielding, LV. 2-player gains elemental resistance +5. Physical damage reduction +5%. Brando was speechless when he saw the tanking talent. He simply erased the message so that it would not disturb his battle mood. To be honest, this talent was one of the stronger ones among the tanking talents. It was a pity that the warriors in the Amber Sword never appeared as tanks, let alone mercenaries with more diverse attacks. He had chosen this talent in a hurry, and now it seemed that this message was a bit sarcastic. Who would stick their face up to a monster for no reason? The Silver Elf guards were now chasing the lizard men up the hills on both sides, and the Dark Bishop seemed to have realized his mistake. Brando suddenly felt that the magic arrow that had been chasing him had stopped. He looked back and saw that the Dark Bishop was surrounded by black smoke. It was obvious that he was chanting and gathering the dark elements, preparing to cast a high circle spell. But Brando would not give him the chance. He was not a rookie who had participated in a boss battle for the first time, and it would take him a long time to figure out the boss intentions. The young man swung his sword behind him, and a wind pressure blew away a few fish that had escaped the net. At the same time he activated charge and his whole body turned into a straight line. The lizardmen warriors around the Dark Bishop did not even have time to react before Brando had already passed through them and reached the Dark Bishop of the Blackfire sect. He raised his sword and slashed with all his strength. It was as if there was a sudden flash of black light, and the long sword that was buffed by power burst crashed into a pitch-black barrier that suddenly appeared. Brando was slightly startled, and then he saw the Dark Bishop's withered claws reach out of his robe, and a large shield surrounded by a dim light appeared in front of him. The person whose face was hidden under the hood gave him a sinister smile. He pointed his finger forward and a black flame suddenly shot out. Magic arrow. P.S. Yesterday someone in the book review section pointed out that Brando's stats were wrong. I checked and found that it was indeed the case. I did not include the strength bonus from the Necklace of the Lesser Ghouls. This was my oversight and I apologize to everyone. There shouldn't be any problems with the rest. As for the growth of experience, it is not a linear growth, but in reality, every profession stats are the same. Finally, I'm going to complain. The people who urge me to update are so despicable. I curse you all to be on the 8th floor. Chapter 179. Magic Arrow? Brendel gritted his teeth and dodged to the side, allowing the flames to graze past his chest. His skin immediately felt like it was on fire, and he knew that it was caused by the corrosion of the dark element. But at least it was better than breaking 2 of his ribs. He sighed in relief. He had forgotten that the Dark Bishop's camouflage skill was very high. Even though he had been guarding against it, he still could not avoid it completely. In the past, the Knight and Judge classes were the ones who took the hit. However, Brando believed in his reflexes and it did not disappoint him. If he had been hit by the Dark Bishop's camouflage skill, he would have been hit by a combination of spells. Even though he would not be killed, he would not be able to survive for a day or two. More importantly, the Nightsong Tiger and the others would probably stop him if he had the chance to gain EXP alone in the future. Fortunately, it was as he had expected. Since the Dark Bishop's camouflage plan did not work, it was time for him to counterattack. Brando's figure flashed, and he was already behind the Dark Bishop. Another slash. The Dark Bishop waved his hand behind him, and the black shield of light that was in front of him immediately circled around to meet Brendel's sword. At the same time, a ball of black flames appeared in his left hand. Brando snorted. The Dark Bishop's submerged light shield only had a hardness of 10, and his previous slash had already destroyed 13% of it. However, the Dark Bishop seemed to think that he would need at least 3 slashes to break through the Dark Bishop's submerged light shield. He was not in a hurry, and he jumped back to avoid the Dark Bishop's second magic arrow. At this moment, the two of them exchanged blows in the blink of an eye. At the same time, the Lizardmen warriors realized that they had lost sight of Brando. They were startled for a moment before they turned around. However, the first thing they saw was this. The Dark Bishop took a step back and after dodging the black flame he immediately attacked again. His sword was glowing. As Brando retreated, he called out his attribute panel and raised his new skill to level 5. After Direct Breakthrough had reached level 5, the damage reduction effect had increased to 10%. In fact, this skill was the nemesis of all heavy armor warriors and boundary wizards, not to mention the Shield of Oblivion of a mere dark elementalist. After the sword began to vibrate at a high frequency, the blade reflected the moonlight and looked like it was coated with a layer of fluorescent light from afar. The Dark Bishop's sword. Brando's Direct Breakthrough? He felt as if half of his strength was used up to half of his strength. But the result didn't disappoint him. The Dark Bishop couldn't believe his eyes as his shield of oblivion turned into black fragments. Then, that simple-looking sword went down and cut into his abdomen. Brando immediately let go of his sword and flashed behind the Dark Bishop. As soon as he moved, the Dark Bishop howled. Large amounts of black flames shot out from his eyes, nostrils, mouth and wounds. These flames were much more beautiful than the magic arrow, as flames at least 10 times more. Even though Brando was standing behind the Dark Bishop, he could still feel the dark elemental energy in the air, which made his skin tingle. Burning half of one's HP to activate the elemental energy in an instant was the last resort of every elementalist. However, only the Dark Bishop of the Black Flame sect was so crazy that he dared to use this spell even though he knew that he had lost more than half of his HP. He wanted to take him down with him. If Brando had not been at a disadvantage like this before, he would have been hit by this spell if he was not careful. Even if he did not die, he would have at least lost a layer of skin. However, no matter what, his white longsword had been destroyed. Unless it was a magic item, very few ordinary items could survive the dark elemental energy. Brando was not sure how much of the sword was left behind, and he did not intend to look at it anyway. He turned around and smiled at the lizard men who were about to surround him. Brando thought that his smile was amiable, but to the lizard men, it was like a devil's smile. They had seen how strong the Dark Bishop was, but he was killed by this young man in the blink of an eye. They were just small fries, what else could they do? The lizard men warriors could not help but look at each other, and then they simply turned around and ran. As a group of bandits, this was in line with their nature. In their eyes, the only thing worth rejoicing about was that the young man did not intend to chase after them. Of course, what they did not know was that Brando was currently in a state of exhaustion. In the last attack he had used both strength burst and frontal assault at the same time. It was important to note that the consumption of skills was multiplied and not added. In other words, in an instant he had used up 15 times his normal stamina. Although it was not to the extent that he had used up all his stamina, it was normal for him to be exhausted after using up so much stamina. Anyway, the battle was coming to an end. He first checked his EXP. Killing the Dark Bishop had given him a total of 4,200 EXP. Even though he had just leveled up, his EXP bar was already at 5645136600, and it was still rapidly increasing. He looked up and saw that the Silver Elves had completely separated the lizard men from both sides and were herding them up the narrow and complicated slope. After the Dark Bishop was killed, the lizard men were almost unable to form a counterattack. They began to retreat. At first, they were able to maintain their formation, but it gradually turned into a mass exodus. The only thing left was to harvest the EXP. Brando simply sat down beside the Dark Bishop's corpse and did not touch the Dark Bishop's corpse. He was well aware of how unlucky he was, so he decided to wait for the Elementalist sisters to open it. He took out a fluorescent crystal from his bosom, lit it up and threw it out. This was a signal that he no longer needed the mercenaries' long-range support, so he decided to let them come down first. But this period of waiting made him feel a little bored. Bored to death, Brando looked at his own attributes. Strength and vitality had both reached 25 ounces, and dexterity had also increased by 3 ounces. He could not help but clench his right hand. This is the strength of a silver. Although it is still a lower tier. But in terms of combat ability, it is already close to an upper tier. Only 2 months. Can you believe it, Brando? You went from a mediocre militia to a silver-ranked knight. The guards that you once yearned for are nothing now. Trust me, we still have a long way to go. Brendel could not help but smile, one hand pressed against his chest, and said to himself in his heart. He was a little emotional, but he knew that this emotion came from the side of him that belonged to this world. Because to Sophie, level 25 was really nothing. He raised his head and saw the mercenaries coming out of the forest one after another. The Grey Wolves mercenaries were obviously more excited than the Nightsong Tiger and the others because they did not know much about their lord. Although Brando said that he would bring them victory, they only realized how easy it was when victory was in their hands. There were no casualties. Even if they had more than 20 gold-tier elven warriors as their allies, it was still a battle of 30 against 200. Not to mention there were also disciples of the Black Flame sect, a silver-tier demon, and the Dark Bishop who had given them nightmares. Sanford was even a little excited when he ran to Brando's side. He could not help but ask in a rude manner, "My lord, you broke through?" Brando nodded. A silver ranked at 20 years old. Sanford and the other Grey Wolves mercenaries looked at each other and could not help but sigh. We are so lucky to be able to witness the birth of two geniuses. There's another one who used to be a member of our mercenary group. His name is Eek. So it's him. Brando raised his eyebrows. However, that wasn't his concern. His gaze scanned the mercenaries and finally landed on the two wild elf sisters who were walking at the back. He immediately waved his hand. Come, Red Hand Soft Sister, help me open up the corpse. Everyone was stunned when they heard Roland's words. Everyone followed Brando's gaze and hesitated for a long time before it finally landed on the elder wild elf sister. The girl was slightly stunned. She looked at the others and hesitantly pointed at herself. Me? Of course, didn't I say it before? Brendel pointed to the Dark Bishop's corpse and said, You're going to open the corpse? No, I mean sort out the loot. The wild elf girl frowned and bit her lips. She glared at Brando and said, My lord, my name is Falerne, not some Red Hand Soft Sister. She was so used to speaking the elven language that she almost had to bite her own tongue before she managed to say it out loud. She then looked at Brendel coldly, thinking that this guy was always causing trouble for her. Brando coughed and explained, All right, Falerne. In fact, Red Hand Soft Sister is a compliment in my hometown. However, he immediately noticed that Falerne was looking at him suspiciously. My lord, I've also been to Karsuk, but the locals don't seem to have such a saying. Sanford whispered. No, it's just a slang between wizards. Brando reacted quickly. Then what does it mean? It means that a person is very lucky, very soft, and is a girl. Even though she didn't know what very soft meant, the elder wild elf girl understood what it meant. She couldn't help but glance at her lord, secretly disdainful, thinking that humans were indeed frivolous fellows. However, considering the relationship between her sister and Brando, Falerne didn't give him a hard time. She nodded and planned to do as he said. But at that moment, everyone heard a series of muffled sounds coming from the east side of the valley. At first, it was a low rumbling sound, then it gradually turned into the sound of something breaking from within. The continuous rumbling sound seemed to come from the ground, and the ground they were standing on trembled. Brando saw that the stones on the ground seemed to have come alive, or rather, they seemed to have been injected with magic and started dancing. He subconsciously looked at his feet. Suddenly he realized that the sound was familiar. It sounded like the disintegration crystals that appeared in the early stages of the Second War of the Black Rose. Speaking of which, he hadn't heard this sound in the game for at least a few decades. It was really familiar. But wait. Brando's expression suddenly changed. He immediately turned around and saw that the cliff on the east side of the valley was collapsing in a cloud of smoke. Everyone fell into the same state of sluggishness. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com to read more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 180. Romaine wasn't able to maintain such a quiet state all the time. She obediently knelt in front of Brando with her head lowered. If it weren't for the fact that she would steal glances at Brando's expression from time to time, she would have the demeanor of a noble's daughter. Of course, her face was covered in dirt, and her clothes were full of scratches. She was in such a sorry state. There was another noble's daughter who was in a similar state. Amandina was clutching her tattered shawl with one hand, her face covered in dust. She lowered her head and didn't say a word, looking a little nervous. Brando. The Roman saw that the young man's dark face seemed to have eased a little, and hurriedly opened her mouth to explain. But before she could finish her sentence, she was glared at by the young man. She could only sullenly lower her head again. She thought that the plan this time was perfect. If it weren't for the little hiccup at the end, she would have been able to help Brando a lot. Besides, even if there was a little hiccup at the end, didn't they still crush a few lizard men to death? Moreover, they also sealed off their escape route. She thought to herself that she must use less next time. But if Brando knew that this damn girl in front of him was still thinking about continuing this dangerous activity next time, he would probably have the mood to strangle her to death. He and Nelina went to the scene to investigate. Originally, Amandina's plan was indeed good, and according to the young lady's original calculations, when the cliff collapsed, it would have killed most of the lizard men who fled in that direction. Unfortunately, she obviously found the wrong partner. No, it shouldn't be said like that. Because Amandina's plan was originally only on paper. If it wasn't for the Roman who saw it, this idea would have been just a proposal until now. But unfortunately there was no if in history. Just like how the word cautious did not exist in the young Roman's dictionary, she had always been a doer, and any of her plans were built on the basis of a matter of fact. Brando thought of this and couldn't help but look at Amandina. The noble's daughter seemed to have felt his gaze and couldn't help but shrink back. She whispered, "I'm sorry, my lord, it's all my fault." "No, this has nothing to do with you." Brando shook his head. Indeed, if the Roman didn't arbitrarily change the amount of medicine that Amandina had said at the end, it wouldn't have caused such a mess. In the end, the lizard men didn't crush 2 lizard men to death, and instead almost buried them under the cliff. Fortunately, Amandina discovered this early, or else the consequences would have been unthinkable. Thinking of this, Brando couldn't help but to Amandina to time. This was what angered him the most. He didn't care how much Roman had helped him. As long as she didn't always put herself in danger, he would be thankful. But he couldn't help but sigh too. Of a person. Of course, and of. But there were times when she was so muddle-headed that it gave people a headache. For example, Brando rubbed his temples. "Have you always been making plans like this?" Brando suddenly asked. Amandina was taken aback. She thought he was going to punish her for her actions, but she didn't. His pampering of the Roman was obvious to everyone. She didn't dare to imagine what Brando would think of her if something happened to the merchant girl because of her. Although she had experienced the most difficult period, people were like this. It was easy to go from frugality to extravagance, but difficult to go from extravagance to frugality. She felt that she could no longer adapt to the life of that time. Moreover, this young lord respected her and was willing to give her the same status and treatment as before. He was also willing to get along with her as an equal. Other than the hard work of trekking in the wilderness every day, she felt that there was nothing she could complain about. Moreover, even if it was hard work, it was only temporary. She still had many plans that had yet to be realized. Thinking of this, she couldn't help but feel ashamed. "I'm sorry." "No." Brando glanced at the Roman to make sure that he wasn't seriously regretting his actions. "I'm talking about those plans." Amandina was stunned. For a moment she didn't understand what Brando wanted to know. But in the end she nodded her head. In fact, ever since Brando pulled her into the group, she had made a complete plan for every action of the youth. At first she was indeed proud of her plans. But later on, it turned out that these plans were often immature. Especially when compared to Brando's prophetic decisions, they were more like the scribbles of a child. Amandina's desire to become Brendel's aide at the start was slowly disappearing from her mind, and she found it laughable. In the end, she did not give up on this habit of hers but Brendel's. But compared to before, this was more like a self-examination. She made plans in advance, and then repeatedly tested her plans throughout the entire incident to see if she had matured enough and if she had given up on those unrealistic ideas. But she didn't think that she would be caught red-handed by the Roman, and he just happened to see her boldest idea. Thinking about it, she felt like Martha was playing a joke on her. "Why didn't you show it to me?" Brando asked. Brando was silent for a moment. He could roughly guess what this girl was thinking. He thought for a moment and said, "Miss Amandina, you are my aide and this is what you recommended to me. Since that's the case, isn't it only right for you to give me your suggestion?" "I'm sorry." "I know, but at that time, I didn't know that I was so childish." "In the future I will," Amandina replied in a small voice, her head almost touching her chest. Of course, Romaine wasn't so embarrassed. In fact, she even tried to interrupt. "Brando, this is my fault. Don't always find trouble with Amandina." Brando was not angered to death by her words. He thought that it was fortunate that he sent the Nightsong Tiger and Nalathar away, or else he wouldn't be able to maintain his dignity. He took a deep breath and was too lazy to pay attention to this girl. Instead, he continued, "Miss Amandina, everyone grows from being childish to mature. But the difference is that not everyone has a brain like yours. If you give up this opportunity because of your childishness, then you will be letting down Lady Martha's favor." After Brando finished speaking, he saw the noble girl looking at him with a puzzled expression. A person's perspective is always limited. Even though the Nightsong Tiger can help me solve many problems and is very experienced, there is one thing that he is far inferior to you, Miss Amandina. Brando pointed at his head. "That's why I hope that you will not put yourself out of this circle. I hope that you can help me. I believe that you can. So, are you willing to help me?" In fact, he wasn't just saying these words to comfort Amandina. He knew that he had the aura of a scammer, and it was a bit scary, especially for a girl like Amandina who was very competitive. It was a huge blow to her confidence. However, Brando knew that his foresight was only temporary. Even if he did not change the history of the world that much, his ability to foresee the future would only last for a few years. A few years later, the players began to participate in the history of this world. Compared to the previous game world, this was the biggest difference between this world and the previous one. Without the participation of players, the direction of the development of history would have some corresponding changes. At that time, his experience and some of the knowledge in the game would still be useful, but his ability to foresee the future would be greatly reduced. In fact, the whole process of this dungeon evolving to a perfect storyline was a wake-up call for him. Brando began to realize that he needed some help. In the previous game he was never a top warrior, nor was he a top leader. Of course, the former could be made up for through experience, but the latter could only be made up for through another path. He had the future goddess of war, but that was not enough. Amandina's ability to discern the overall situation from small details was not something he could compare to. He looked at her and believed that she should have this ability as well. Perhaps there was a gap between her and a prophet, but it should be more than enough to be an aid. Amandina was stunned. Brando's words, "I believe that you can," had deeply moved her. To a prideful person, there was nothing more precious than trust. Even though she still believed that Brando was comforting her, she took a light breath and nodded seriously. Her nod was not just an agreement but a determination. She was willing to participate in his wishes. Brando did not expect his words to have such a great effect. He thought that at least he had dispelled her doubts. In his opinion, Amandina was a little too introverted. But he looked at the Roman and asked again, "Do you still have those exploding crystals?" "My lord, you know about them?" Amandina was surprised again. "Ahem, something like that." Brando coughed. Could it be that this era doesn't have such things? Could it be that the exploding crystals were invented by this girl? How can there be such a coincidence? But he still said vaguely, "The Wizard Tower has something similar, so I just asked casually." "What a coincidence," Amandina whispered. "The name I gave it is also exploding crystals. In fact, I used the core of the mana conduction device to complete it, because the way it works is to use mana to break through the stable framework of the laws of the material world, causing the elements to quickly activate and create an explosion. That's why I gave it this name." "So you really invented it?" Brando could not help but look at the girl again. This thing is not small. Even though it was gradually phased out in the later stages of the Second War of the Black Rose, it still caused a great impact in the early stages. At that time, the players all thought that this thing was an explosive in the world of magic. Unfortunately, the structure of this thing was too unstable, and it was not suitable for transportation and storage. Moreover, in the later stages of the war, the power of this thing became weaker. "Do you have more?" he asked. "There are still some," Amandina immediately replied. "If my lord needs them, I can make some overnight." "Overnight?" Brando was taken aback. "That's not right? Why would I need at least half a month to make this thing?" Seeing Amandina nodding, Brando almost thought that history had changed and she had actually invented something else. Exploding crystals that only take a few hours to make? Isn't it a little too light to call it a cheat? But just as he was about to ask, he saw the Nightsong Tiger waving at him from the forest below with an anxious look on his face. Why is he here again? Aren't they cleaning up the battlefield with the red-handed girl? Brando was stunned for a moment, but when he saw that the Nightsong Tiger was about to run up to him, he immediately said to Amandina, "If it's possible, I hope that everyone can have 1 or 2 pieces. By the way, this thing is very unstable, right?" Amandina looked at him in surprise, then nodded. She felt that she was a little numb to her lord's foresight. As expected. Brando breathed a sigh of relief. "History hasn't changed yet," he said. "I'll teach you a method later. It can temporarily stabilize it, but the effect is limited. You can research the rest on your own." "Ah." Amandina couldn't help but cry out in surprise. "He knows about this too?" Amandina thought that she had at least become a little more resilient, but she couldn't help but feel another blow. She originally thought that she had some advantages in the field of magic, but she didn't expect Brando to know more about it than her. But this noble girl from the Braggs probably didn't know that she had wronged Brando this time. This was because Brando didn't know anything about magic. In the game, it was a skill that only pure secondary class players could choose. A combat class player like him was destined to have no chance. But even if he didn't understand it, it didn't stop Brando from knowing some materials and recipes, right? While Amandina was still in shock, The Roman finally noticed that the only person who could control her had left. Amandina let out a long sigh, then said gratefully to Amandina, "Thank you, Amandina." Amandina looked at her and quickly shook her head. "As long as you don't cause trouble for me, I'll thank the heavens." To be honest, she was now afraid of this young lady. But the Roman didn't seem to want to let go of the only person who could talk to her. She thought for a moment and asked, "Right, Amandina, did you see that?" That's right. When we were being buried, we were still alive. It looks like there are some fireflies flying towards us from the bottom of the hill. Did you notice that?" Was it? It seems like it. When Brando saw the Nightsong Tiger, he saw the veteran mercenary captain holding a thick book with a black cover. He was slightly surprised. This book was undoubtedly the Dark Bishop's relic. At least, the 3 lightning-like scratches on the book had already deeply betrayed it. But Brando was a little surprised. The red-handed girl was indeed a red-handed girl. She was actually able to get an item from the Dark Bishop, who was publicly known as a pauper. If this was in the past, he would be able to brag about it on the forums. Unfortunately, there were no forums here, and this made Brando feel a little awkward. Moreover, he wasn't the one who opened this book. "What is this?" he asked. The Nightsong Tiger looked at him mysteriously and didn't say a word. He just gently opened the book in front of him. Brando only took a glance, and then he was petrified. P.S. Perfectly defeated the prophetic emperor. All of you will be sent to the 8th floor. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. You're tuning in to the Han Li's Wuxia Adventures YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.